In a quiet headquarters far across the Pacific, one man sat alone with the knowledge that his next decision would ask thousands of young Americans to step into the fire, and he understood, in the deepest part of himself, that many of them would never come home. He was not a man given to grand gestures or easy answers. Admiral Chester Nimitz had learned long ago that leadership in war often meant carrying burdens no one else could see. On this night, like so many others, the map spread before him told only part of the story. The rest lived in the faces he could not stop imagining, boys from small towns and city streets, young husbands who had written letters to wives they might never hold again, sons who had promised their mothers they would be careful. The choice before him was not simply about strategy or territory. It was about how much blood the nation was willing to spend to bring the war closer to its end. The Pacific had already exacted a terrible price. Earlier campaigns had shown what happened when determined men clashed over tiny patches of ground. Nimitz had seen the reports, read the letters from commanders who described the exhaustion, the courage, and the quiet moments when a wounded Marine would still try to smile for the corpsman kneeling beside him. He had visited hospitals where young men with missing limbs or haunted eyes tried to make sense of what they had survived. Those visits stayed with him. They were never far from his thoughts when the planners gathered around the long table and the conversation turned, once again, to the next move. His team carried their own private weights. Some had lost friends in the early, desperate months after the surprise attack that had brought America into the war. Others had sons or brothers serving in distant ships and foxholes. When they spoke of the coming operation, their voices were steady, professional, but Nimitz could hear the pauses, the moments when a man stopped short of saying what everyone in the room already understood. Every island seized was one more step toward forcing the enemy to surrender. Every step forward also meant more telegrams would be delivered to front doors back home. The arithmetic was brutal, and no one at that table pretended otherwise. They had come to believe that the only way to shorten the war, the only way to eventually bring the boys home, was to keep the pressure relentless. To wait, to hesitate, to let the enemy dig deeper and reinforce, would only multiply the cost later. That belief had been forged in the hard lessons of previous fights where American forces had learned that the enemy would not yield easily, that every position would be contested with a ferocity that shocked even seasoned veterans. The planners knew that whatever island they chose next would be defended with everything the enemy had left. They also knew that doing nothing was not an option. The longer the war dragged on, the more families would receive the news that changed their lives forever. Nimitz listened more than he spoke in those meetings. He had a way of letting every argument unfold, of weighing not just the military logic but the human reality behind it. He thought about the young Marines who would have to climb down the cargo nets into the landing craft, the sailors who would man the guns through long nights at sea, the corpsmen who would run through fire to reach the wounded. He thought about their mothers and fathers waiting by mailboxes, their sweethearts clutching photographs, their little brothers and sisters who still believed war was something that happened in newsreels. The decision was not abstract to him. It never had been. Late one evening, after the others had gone, Nimitz remained at his desk. The only sounds were the distant murmur of typewriters and the soft scratch of his own pen. He wrote to his wife, careful not to say too much, yet needing to put something of the weight into words. He wrote about the steady courage of the men he commanded, about the way they faced what was asked of them without complaint. He did not write about the fear that sometimes rose in his own chest when he imagined what those same men would soon endure. That fear he carried alone. Across the ocean, in training camps and aboard crowded transports, the men who would carry out the orders were living their own stories. A young Marine from a farm in the Midwest sat on his bunk and reread a letter from his mother. She had written about the harvest, about the neighbor's new calf, about how the church had prayed for him on Sunday. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket, close to his heart. He did not tell her that the training had grown more intense, that the lectures about what to expect on a hostile shore had become more specific. He did not want her to worry. Instead, he wrote back about the friends he had made, about the way they looked out for one another, about how he was eating well and staying strong. In the quiet moments between training and sleep, he wondered what the next chapter would bring, and whether the boy who had left home would be the same one who returned. Another Marine, a little older, already carried the memory of earlier fighting. He had seen friends fall, had helped carry stretchers under fire, had written letters to mothers whose sons would not be coming home. When the word filtered down that a new operation was coming, he did not cheer. He simply checked his equipment one more time, made sure his buddy had enough extra bandages, and tried to get what sleep he could. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep moving forward anyway, to look after the man next to you, to do the job that had to be done so that maybe, someday, the war would end and ordinary life could begin again. Back in the headquarters, the final pieces of the plan were falling into place. Nimitz understood that the choice carried risks that could not be fully calculated. The enemy had spent months turning the target into a fortress of concrete and coral. The approach would be difficult. The landing itself would be dangerous. Yet every alternative seemed to promise even greater losses down the road. To strike now, while the initiative was theirs, offered the best chance of keeping the enemy off balance and bringing the larger conflict to a close sooner. It was a calculation measured not in territory alone, but in the lives that might be saved if the war did not stretch on for another year or two. The Admiral rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the Pacific stretched dark and endless under the stars. Somewhere out there, the ships were already gathering, the men already preparing. He thought of the long voyage they would make, the mixture of excitement and dread that would fill their days and nights. He thought of the letters they would write and the ones they would receive. He thought of the quiet courage that would be required of them when the moment came. And he thought of the families who did not yet know that their sons and husbands and brothers had been chosen for this particular test. In that moment, the weight of command felt almost physical. Nimitz had guided the fleet through the darkest days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had celebrated the hard-won victories that followed. He had written too many letters of condolence. Now he was asking more of the same generation of young men. The necessity was clear. The cost was equally clear. Both truths lived side by side in his mind, and neither would ever leave him. The orders went out. The great ships began to move. Across thousands of miles of ocean, thousands of young Americans carried with them the hopes of a nation and the private fears that no uniform could hide. Some wrote final letters before the ship sailed. Others simply stared at the horizon and wondered what they would find when they reached it. In the map rooms and headquarters, the planners turned to the next set of problems, but the decision about this particular island stayed with them. It would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The men who had made the choice and the men who would carry it out shared something profound, even if they would never meet. They were all part of the same story, a story of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things, of leaders who carried the burden of sending others into danger, and of young warriors who would discover, on a distant shore, just how much they were capable of giving. That story was only beginning. The coral beaches and the fierce fighting that awaited them would test every assumption, every plan, every ounce of courage the nation could muster. And when it was over, the world would understand, in a way it could not yet, what it had truly cost to take that one small step across the Pacific. If you want to see the faces behind decisions like these brought vividly to life, and to honor the courage of the men who fought across the Pacific in those pivotal years, there is something truly special waiting for you. Amazon offers a wonderful collection of World War II memorabilia. From carefully crafted ship models and historical books filled with veterans' own words to authentic period pieces that let you hold a small part of that history in your hands. And if you want to experience the tension, the leadership, and the raw human drama of the Pacific Campaign on screen, the powerful film Midway on Prime Video captures it with remarkable heart and intensity. It is a way to connect with the men we have been talking about, to see their world, and to remember why their sacrifices still matter. Please, To keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the fleet moved steadily toward its rendezvous with history, the men aboard those ships carried more than weapons and orders. They carried the hopes of families they might never see again, the quiet promises they had made to one another, and the stubborn belief that what they were doing mattered, that every hard step forward brought the war one day closer to its end. The decision had been made in a room filled with maps and responsibility. The real story, the one written in courage and loss and unbreakable bonds, was about to unfold on a tiny atoll most of them had never heard of until a few weeks earlier. And nothing, not the plans, not the briefings, not even the weight carried by the admiral who had sent them, could fully prepare them for what they were about to face. The Pacific was waiting. And so was history. In a place of impossible beauty, where the lagoon shimmered like liquid glass under the tropical sun and palm trees swayed gently in the salt wind, men worked with aching backs and blistered hands to turn paradise into a place that would one day demand blood from anyone who tried to take it. They were not machines. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands who had been sent to this remote speck of coral and sand with orders that left little room for mercy, not toward the enemy, and not toward themselves. Under the command of Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, a career officer who carried his responsibility like a second uniform, they began the slow, grinding transformation of Betio. What had once been a quiet atoll where fishermen worked and children played became something else entirely, a fortress built not with grand machines but with sweat, coral, concrete, and an unshakable sense of duty that ran deeper than exhaustion or fear. Shibasaki walked the narrow paths between the growing positions almost every day. He was not a distant figure who stayed in the shade. He moved among his men, stopping to speak with the engineers mixing concrete under the fierce sun, crouching beside soldiers digging by hand when tools broke or supplies ran thin. He saw the way their shoulders slumped at the end of long shifts, the way coral cuts on their legs festered in the heat and humidity, the way some of them stared out at the empty horizon as if trying to will their families' faces into view. Yet when he spoke to them, his voice carried a steady calm that asked for more than they thought they had left to give. He reminded them, quietly, that this island was now their home, their responsibility, and that every bunker they finished, every tunnel they connected, every obstacle they placed along the shore was another reason the enemy would pay dearly if they ever came. The men listened because they believed in him, and because they believed in one another. In the evenings, when the work paused and the only sounds were the waves against the reef and the distant murmur of the sea, small moments of humanity surfaced. A younger soldier from a mountain village in Japan would share a piece of dried fish he had been saving with an older man whose hands were too swollen to hold his own rations comfortably. They did not speak of the coming battle. They spoke instead of home, of rice fields ready for harvest, of mothers waiting by the door, of the simple comfort of a hot bath after a long day. These conversations were brief, almost whispered, as if saying the words too loudly might break the fragile peace they had built among themselves. One soldier, a quiet man named Hiroshi who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, kept a small notebook hidden in his pack. In it he wrote letters he would never send. He described the color of the lagoon at sunrise, the way the coral glowed pink and gold when the light hit it just right, and how strange it felt to be building death into something so beautiful. He wrote to his wife about the way the men looked out for each other when one of them stumbled from exhaustion, how an officer had once given his own canteen to a private who was too proud to ask for water. Hiroshi did not write about the fear that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night, the fear that all this work, all this sacrifice, might still not be enough. He wrote instead about duty, about the promise he had made to protect what mattered, even if that protection looked like concrete walls and fields of fire. The work itself was relentless. Day after day the men hauled coral fragments, mixed them with cement that arrived in limited shipments, and poured it into forms that would become the walls of bunkers sunk deep into the earth. They dug tunnels by hand, connecting one position to another so that even if the surface was shattered, men could still move, still fight, still survive long enough to make the attackers pay. The heat pressed down on them like a living thing. Sweat stung their eyes. Their skin burned and peeled and burned again. Coral dust coated their throats and lungs. Yet they kept going because stopping felt like betrayal of their comrades, of their families back home, of the quiet understanding that this was the task they had been given and they would see it through. Shibasaki watched it all with a mixture of pride and something heavier. He knew the island was becoming strong in ways the enemy could not yet see from the air or from ships at sea. The defenses were not built to look impressive from a distance. They were built to survive. Positions were camouflaged with palm fronds and sand. Gun emplacements were sunk low so that only the barrels showed when they fired. Interconnected tunnels allowed movement under cover. The beaches themselves were being shaped into killing zones, obstacles placed where landing craft would be forced to slow, where men would be exposed for the longest possible time. Every decision Shibasaki made carried the same weight the American admiral across the ocean was feeling, the knowledge that young lives depended on how well this work was done. There were days when the strain showed. A soldier might snap at a comrade over something small, a misplaced tool, a delayed water break, only to apologize moments later with a tired hand on the shoulder. An engineer might sit alone for a few minutes, staring at his raw palms, before standing up and returning to the mix. Shibasaki made a point of noticing these moments. He did not scold. He simply appeared beside the man, offered a quiet word about how much had already been accomplished, and moved on. The men noticed. In small ways, they began to mirror that steadiness. When one position was finished ahead of schedule, the whole crew helped another team that was struggling. When a man fell ill from the heat, others took his shift without being asked. These were not grand acts of heroism. They were the quiet daily choices that kept the work moving and the spirit from breaking. As the weeks passed and the fortress took clearer shape, the men began to move into the positions they had built. They stocked ammunition, checked fields of fire, and learned the layout of the tunnels until they could navigate them in darkness. At night they sometimes sat together near the entrances, sharing what little comfort they had, a shared cigarette, a story from childhood, a moment of laughter that felt almost out of place in the growing tension. They knew the enemy was coming. They could feel it in the way supplies arrived less frequently, and the way lookouts scanned the empty horizon with greater urgency. Yet they did not speak of defeat. They spoke instead of what they had already given to this place, and of the promise they had made to one another that no matter what came across the water, they would meet it together. Shibasaki made his final rounds as the work reached its peak. He walked through the bunkers, ran his hand along the rough concrete walls, and looked into the faces of the men who would fight from them. He saw exhaustion, yes, but he also saw something else, a quiet, fierce resolve that had nothing to do with hatred and everything to do with loyalty. These men had taken a beautiful, peaceful island and turned it into something that would break the heart of anyone who tried to take it by force. They had done it not because they loved war, but because they loved the idea of returning home someday, and because they had been taught that duty to comrades and to nation was the highest calling a man could answer. Shibasaki carried that same resolve. He knew the coming battle would be unlike anything most of them had experienced. He also knew that the island they had built together would ask everything of the men who tried to storm it. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the lagoon lay still and the only movement was the gentle sway of the remaining palms, the men took their places. Some wrote final letters they hoped might one day reach their families. Others simply sat with their thoughts, remembering the faces of people they might never see again. Hiroshi tucked his notebook deeper into his pack and touched the small shell he had found on the beach weeks earlier, the one reminder of beauty he had allowed himself to keep. Then he climbed into his position, checked his weapon one last time, and waited. They had turned coral into steel and silence into strength. They had given this place everything they had, their labor, their health, their private hopes, and now they would give whatever came next. The fortress was no longer just concrete and tunnels. It was the living expression of their duty, their endurance, and their refusal to yield even when the odds were stacked against them. And as the first light touched the water, they waited together, bound by the work they had done and the promise they had made to one another in the long, hot days that had led to this moment. The world would one day hear stories of what happened here, stories told mostly by those who attacked. But the real story of how this island became what it became lived in the hands that mixed the concrete, the backs that carried the loads, the quiet conversations in the dark, and the steady presence of a commander who refused to ask of his men anything he would not share. These were not faceless defenders. They were men who had turned a paradise into a place of resolve, and who now waited to see whether that resolve would be enough. If you want to see the reality of what these men built and endured, the bunkers as they actually stood, the positions carved into coral, the raw and often devastating truth of how war transforms both a place and the people who defend it, there is a collection that shows it without softening or censorship. The exclusive Gumroad archive contains rare, uncensored photographs and footage from Tarawa and the wider Pacific campaign, material too graphic and honest for most platforms to host. These images let you witness the human cost and the engineering determination in a way that words alone cannot fully convey, offering a deeper, unflinching connection to the story we have been exploring together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened across the lagoon, the men remained in their positions. The work was finished. The waiting had begun. They had done all that duty and determination could ask of them. Now the island itself would speak, not with words, but with the fierce, silent resolve of every man who had helped shape it from coral and steel into something that would not be taken easily. The horizon remained empty for now. But they knew, with the same certainty that had carried them through every blistering day of labor, that it would not stay empty forever. And when the ships finally appeared, the men who had built this place would be ready to meet whatever came with the same quiet strength that had defined every hour they had spent here. They were not names on a roster or faces in a newsreel. They were young men who still carried the smell of home in their sea bags, the faint trace of their mother's cooking, the last kiss from a sweetheart, the quiet dreams they had not yet spoken out loud. Across America, in small towns and crowded cities, these men had answered a call that reached far beyond any battlefield. Some had volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, their anger still fresh and raw. Others had been drafted and stepped forward because turning away had never felt like an option. They came from farms where the soil stained their hands, from factories where the machines never stopped, from neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone else's business. Now they were bound together by the same green uniform and the same uncertain future, sailing toward an island most of them could not yet pronounce. Take the young man from the rolling hills of Iowa. He had grown up walking behind a plow, listening to the steady rhythm of the tractor and the distant lowing of cattle. His hands were strong from years of work, but they trembled slightly when he wrote the last letter before the ship sailed. He told his girl back home that he was fine, that the food was better than he expected, that he and the other fellows were looking out for each other. He did not write about the nights when he lay awake in his bunk, listening to the engines and wondering whether he would ever see the harvest again, or hold her hand again, or watch their children grow up under the same white sky. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into the envelope, and handed it to the ship's mail clerk with the same quiet care he once used to place eggs in a basket. Then he returned to his bunk, lay back, and stared at the metal ceiling, letting the steady thrum of the engines become the only sound in his world for a little while. A few bunks away, a city kid from Philadelphia kept his own silence in a different way. He had grown up in row houses where the trolley bells rang late into the night and the smell of coal smoke hung in the air. When the news of Pearl Harbor reached him, he had not hesitated. He had seen the photographs in the papers, the burning ships, the smoke rising over the harbor, and something inside him had shifted. Now, months later, He sat on the deck during the long Pacific crossing, dealing cards with the same quick hands that had once run numbers on a street corner. He laughed loudly when he won a hand, but the laughter never quite reached his eyes. At night he sometimes pulled out a small photograph of his younger sister, the one he had promised to bring home a souvenir from the war. He had not yet decided what that souvenir would be. He only knew that whatever happened on the coming shore, he wanted to be the kind of man she could still look up to when he finally walked through the front door again. There were others, quieter ones, who carried their thoughts even deeper. One Marine, a thoughtful boy from a small town in Oregon, kept a small notebook in his breast pocket. He wrote in it every evening, not grand thoughts about duty or glory, but small observations, the way the light changed on the water at dusk, the sound of the waves against the hull, the way his buddy from Texas hummed old country songs when he thought no one was listening. He had always wanted to be a writer. The war had interrupted that dream, but he refused to let it die completely. In the notebook he preserved the ordinary moments that made these extraordinary days bearable, the shared joke during a long watch, the way the chaplain's voice cracked slightly when he prayed over the men before they turned in, the small kindness of one Marine giving up his dry socks to another whose feet were blistered from the constant damp. These were the things he wanted to remember if he made it home. These were the things he feared he might forget if the coming days became too loud. The training that had brought them to this point had been merciless, yet it had also forged something stronger than any individual. In the camps they had run until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, only to be helped up by the man beside them. They had crawled through mud and barbed wire while instructors shouted that the enemy would not wait for them to catch their breath. They had learned to shoot, to move as a unit, to trust the man on their left and right with their lives. But they had also learned something the training manuals never quite captured, that courage often looked like ordinary decency under pressure. A Marine who had grown up in the segregated South found himself sharing his last clean shirt with a black Marine from Detroit after a long day in the rain. Neither of them spoke about it afterward. The shirt was simply returned, washed and folded, with a quiet nod that said more than words could. These small crossings of invisible lines happened more often than anyone expected, born not of speeches but of shared exhaustion and the simple need to survive together. On the transports, as the days stretched into weeks, the men settled into the strange rhythm of life at sea. They played cards and wrote letters. They lined up for chow and complained about the food even while they ate every bite. They stood on deck at night and watched the stars wheel overhead, some of them seeing an ocean for the first time. In those quiet hours the conversations turned inward. One Marine spoke softly about his father, who had fought in the last war and had come home changed in ways he still did not understand. Another admitted, almost in a whisper, that he was afraid, not of dying, exactly, but of failing the men who were counting on him. The others did not mock him. They simply passed him a cigarette or a canteen and let the silence hold what words could not. In those moments they were no longer farm boys or city kids or factory workers. They were simply men who had been given an impossible task and were trying, in the only ways they knew, to be ready for it. The letters they sent home carried the weight of everything they could not say out loud. A young husband wrote to his wife that he missed the sound of her singing while she hung the laundry. He told her the ocean was bigger than he had imagined and that the sunsets were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He did not tell her that every sunset also brought the thought that it might be his last. A father wrote to his young son, promising to bring back a real Japanese sword if he could, and asking him to take care of his mother while he was gone. The boy would receive that letter weeks after the battle had already begun, long after the father had already given everything he had to give. As the fleet moved steadily closer to its destination, the mood on the ships began to shift. The laughter grew quieter. The card games lasted later into the night. Men who had once joked about what they would do when they got home now spoke instead about what they hoped their buddies would do if one of them did not make it back. They checked their equipment one more time, cleaned weapons that were already clean, and wrote final letters they hoped would never need to be delivered. The quiet resilience that had carried them through training now carried them through these final days at sea. They did not know exactly what waited for them on the coral beaches ahead. They only knew that whatever it was, they would face it together, because that was what they had been trained to do and because the man beside them had become, in every way that mattered, their brother. In the early morning hours before the first light touched the water, some of them stood at the rail and looked out toward the horizon. The sea was calm. The sky was still dark. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the earth, lay the island that would test everything they had learned about themselves. They did not speak of glory or of history. They spoke, when they spoke at all, of home, of the girl they wanted to marry, the child they wanted to hold, the parents they wanted to make proud. These were the hopes they carried, not as burdens but as reasons. Reasons to keep their heads down when the shells began to fall. Reasons to help the man next to them when he stumbled. Reasons to do the job they had been sent to do, even when every instinct told them to turn and run. They were ordinary young men from every corner of a vast country, and they had been asked to do something extraordinary. They had left behind everything familiar and stepped into a future that offered no guarantees. Yet in the quiet spaces between the engines and the waves, and the letters folded carefully into pockets and the small kindnesses passed from hand to hand, they carried something the planners in distant headquarters could never fully measure. They carried the living, breathing heart of the nation that had sent them. Its hopes, its fears, its stubborn belief that ordinary people, when called upon, could find within themselves the courage to change the course of history. And as the first pale light began to touch the eastern sky, those young men stood together on the decks of ships that carried them toward an island they had never seen, ready to write the next chapter of their lives in whatever language the coming hours would demand. These are the real faces behind every strategic decision and every distant map. The letters they wrote, the fears they carried in silence, the small acts of decency that kept them human even as they prepared for the inhuman. These are the details that make the story of Tarawa something more than a list of positions taken or ground gained. Preserving those individual stories, finding the letters that survived, and making sure the men who wrote them are remembered as fathers and sons and friends rather than simply as casualties requires ongoing work. If these stories have moved you, and you want to help keep the memory of these ordinary men alive for the generations who will come after us, even the smallest contribution makes a real difference. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the ships continued their steady progress across the open water, the men below decks and on the rails began to sense the change in the air. The waiting was almost over. The island that had been only a name on a briefing map was about to become the place where every letter they had written, every fear they had swallowed, and every bond they had formed would be tested in the most final way possible. They did not know yet how many of them would step onto that coral and never step off again. They only knew that whatever happened in the hours and days ahead, they would face it the same way they had faced everything that had brought them here, together, with the quiet courage of men who had already given their ordinary lives to something larger than themselves. The faces in the crowd were no longer just faces. They were the living reason an entire nation had placed its hopes on their shoulders, and they were ready, in the only way young men can ever be ready, to carry that hope as far as it needed to go. They crossed an ocean so vast that the horizon never seemed to end, carrying with them everything they had left behind and everything they feared they might never see again. The transports moved steadily through the blue water like a slow, determined parade. Below decks the air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and the faint trace of the last meal served in the galley. Bunks were stacked so close that a man could reach out and touch the boots of the Marine sleeping above him. Yet in that crowded, rolling world, something unexpected began to take shape. The same young men who had trained together in the dust and mud of camps now learned to live together in the constant motion of the sea. They learned each other's stories, the small habits that revealed who they really were when the uniform was the only thing they had in common. The farm boy from Iowa had found a spot near one of the hatches where the air felt fresher. Every evening he sat there with a small stack of paper and wrote. His letters home had grown longer as the days passed. He described the color of the water at midday, the way it turned from deep blue to silver when the sun was high. He wrote about the other men, the one from Texas who could make everyone laugh with a single story, the quiet kid from Oregon who always seemed to be writing in a notebook of his own. He never mentioned the growing tightness in his chest when he thought about what waited at the end of this voyage. Instead, he told his girl that he was proud to be part of something important, that the fellows around him were the best men he had ever known. Then he would fold the letter, seal it, and carry it to the mail pouch as if delivering it in person might somehow bring him closer to home. A few feet away, the young man from Philadelphia sat on his bunk dealing cards with anyone who would play. The games helped pass the hours, but they also served another purpose. When the cards were in his hands, he did not have to think about the way the ship rolled in heavy swells or the way some of the older Marines had grown quieter as the days stretched on. One afternoon, he won a small pile of cigarettes from a Marine who had been in an earlier campaign. Instead of keeping them all, he quietly slipped half the pack into the other man's pocket when no one was looking. The older Marine noticed later and said nothing, but the next morning he made sure the city kid got an extra cup of coffee from the galley. These small exchanges happened constantly, a shared can of peaches, a dry pair of socks passed from one man to another, a story told at just the right moment to pull someone out of a dark mood. They were not grand gestures. They were the quiet ways men reminded each other that they were not alone on this endless stretch of water. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon spent most of his time on deck when the weather allowed. He watched the sea the way some men watch a fire, with a kind of steady attention that missed nothing. In his notebook he recorded the changing light, the way the waves sometimes looked like moving hills and other times like flat glass. He also wrote about the men around him. He noticed how the chaplain moved among the bunks in the evenings, stopping to listen when someone needed to talk. He noticed how the toughest-looking Marines sometimes sat alone after mail call, staring at a single letter for a long time before carefully tucking it away. One night he wrote about a conversation he had overheard between two men who had both left young children behind. They had spoken not about the war, but about the ordinary things, first steps, first words, the way a child's hand felt when it reached up for yours. The writer closed his notebook after that and simply sat with the sound of the engines, letting the ordinary hopes of those two fathers settle into his own chest. As the days passed, the routines of shipboard life became a kind of comfort. There were physical drills on deck when the sea was calm enough, weapons inspections, lectures that prepared the men for what might come without ever naming the exact place. The food was the same every day, yet men lined up for it because standing in line together gave them a few more minutes to talk. Religious services were held whenever the weather and the schedule allowed. The chaplain's voice carried over the sound of the waves as men stood with heads bowed, some of them praying for the first time in years. Afterward they would linger, not quite ready to return to the crowded compartments below. In those moments the sea around them felt almost peaceful, as if the vast blue horizon could hold their fears and their hopes at the same time. But the peace was never complete. Every man carried his own private weight. The farm boy from Iowa sometimes woke in the middle of the night convinced he could already smell the cordite and coral dust of the coming battle, even though the only smells around him were salt and diesel. The city kid from Philadelphia found himself checking his equipment more often than necessary, his quick hands moving over the same straps and buckles again and again. The older Marine who had seen earlier fighting sometimes sat alone on deck long after lights out, smoking one cigarette after another and staring at the dark water as if he could already see the shapes of the landing craft that would soon be lowered. They did not speak of these moments to one another. Instead, they carried them quietly, the way they carried their sea bags and their rifles, part of the load that had to be borne if any of them were going to make it home. The long voyage across the Pacific did something to time. Days blurred into one another, yet each one felt longer than the last. The men learned to measure time not by clocks but by the rhythm of the ship, the change of watches, the call to chow, the brief periods when they were allowed on deck for fresh air. They learned each other's stories in pieces, the Marine whose wife had just had their first child, the one whose brother had already been killed in another theater, the quiet kid who had never been farther from home than the next county until he joined up. These fragments of lives became the glue that held them together. When one man received bad news from home, the others made space for him without being asked. When another man's birthday passed unnoticed by anyone but himself, someone produced a small piece of chocolate saved from a ration pack and placed it on his bunk with a note that simply said, "From the fellows." The educational reality of moving an entire division across thousands of miles of ocean was visible in every crowded compartment and every carefully stacked crate of supplies. These ships carried not only men but the food, ammunition, medical equipment, and spare parts that would be needed once they reached their destination. The logistics of such a movement were staggering, yet to the men living inside it the experience was deeply personal. They were not thinking about supply lines or strategic distances. They were thinking about the letter they still needed to finish, the buddy whose seasickness had not improved after 2 weeks. The growing certainty that the peaceful horizon they watched every day would soon be replaced by something entirely different. As the fleet drew closer to its objective, the mood on the transports changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The card games lasted later. The laughter was louder in some moments and completely absent in others. Men who had once complained about the crowded conditions now seemed almost grateful for the closeness of their bunks, as if the presence of other bodies nearby made the unknown future feel slightly less lonely. The chaplain held more services. The mail clerk worked longer hours. And on the decks, when the weather allowed, men stood in small groups and looked toward the horizon that had once seemed endless and now felt like it was holding its breath. One evening the farm boy from Iowa finished his letter earlier than usual. He sat for a long time with the sealed envelope in his hand, not quite ready to let it go. Finally he stood, walked to the mail pouch, and dropped it in. Then he returned to his spot by the hatch and simply watched the water. The city kid from Philadelphia dealt one last hand of cards and then quietly gathered the deck without collecting his winnings. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon closed his notebook, tucked it into his pocket, and joined the others at the rail. None of them spoke of what was coming. They did not need to. The long journey across the blue horizon had already done its work. It had taken ordinary young men from every corner of their country and slowly, steadily, turned them into something else, a group of strangers who had become, through shared days and shared silences, a single living thing moving together toward whatever waited at the end of the voyage. The sea remained calm. The engines continued their steady rhythm. And somewhere beyond the curve of the world, the island that had been only a name on a map was drawing closer with every passing hour. The men on the transports did not know exactly when they would see it. They only knew that when the moment came, they would meet it the same way they had met every other moment of this long crossing, together, carrying the hopes and fears and quiet courage that no amount of ocean could wash away. The journey across that endless blue horizon had been more than travel. It had been a final, necessary transformation. The men who had boarded these ships weeks earlier were not exactly the same men who now stood at the rails watching the water. They had been changed by the closeness, by the stories shared, by the small kindnesses that cost nothing and meant everything. They had been changed by the time they had been given to think about what they might be asked to do and who they wanted to be when they did it. That change was invisible to anyone watching from a distance, yet it was as real as the salt air and the rolling deck beneath their feet. And it was that invisible strength, more than any weapon or plan, that would soon be tested on a distant shore. If these stories of ordinary men facing an extraordinary journey have stayed with you, and you want to go deeper into the unfiltered human experiences of World War II, the letters, the conversations, the raw realities that shaped these lives, there is a place where that deeper connection is possible. The Patreon community brings together history lovers who want the complete, uncensored picture, with extended podcasts, raw video segments, and conversations that explore the full truth behind events like these. It is a way to stay with these stories long after the ships have reached their destination and to connect with others who believe these individual lives deserve to be remembered in full. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the final night of the voyage settled over the fleet, the men moved through their routines one last time. Equipment was checked again. Letters were written and sealed. Small groups gathered in quiet corners to speak in low voices about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. The farm boy from Iowa lay in his bunk and thought about the fields he had left behind. The city kid from Philadelphia dealt one last imaginary hand of cards in his mind. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon opened his notebook one final time and wrote a single line, "We are ready, whatever comes." Then he closed it, placed it in his pocket, and closed his eyes. The engines kept their steady rhythm. The sea stretched dark and endless around them. And somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon that had once seemed to go on forever, the test they had been preparing for was waiting. The long journey was almost over. The real story was about to begin. They had planned for everything except the one thing the ocean itself would decide. On the flagship, in a compartment filled with maps and the steady hum of radios, the men who carried the weight of the coming invasion sat around a table that seemed too small for the decisions resting on it. The sea outside rolled gently, almost deceptively calm, as if it were trying to hide what it knew. Admiral Kelly Turner, the man responsible for getting the Marines ashore, studied the latest reports with the same careful attention he gave every detail. Beside him, Major General Julian Smith, who would lead the division onto the beaches, listened without interrupting. Both men had spent weeks, months even, shaping this operation. They had studied aerial photographs, interrogated prisoners when they could, and pored over every scrap of intelligence that reached them. Yet in the final hours before the first wave was scheduled to go in, a quiet but insistent doubt had begun to grow. The tide tables had been studied and restudied. The planners had calculated the height of the water based on the best information available. They had expected the landing craft to clear the reef that ringed the atoll and carry the Marines all the way to the beach in relative safety. Now, with the transports already in position and the men below decks making their final preparations, new information and old assumptions were colliding in ways no one had fully anticipated. The water was lower than the tables had predicted. The reef would be exposed or barely covered. The landing craft would not be able to cross it as planned. Turner stood and walked to the small porthole, looking out at the dark shapes of the other ships. He had commanded amphibious operations before. He knew how quickly a plan could unravel once the first boat hit the water. He also knew that calling off or significantly altering the landing at this stage would carry its own terrible costs. The men would lose momentum, the enemy would have more time to prepare, and the larger strategic timetable for the entire campaign could slip. Yet the thought of sending thousands of young Marines into chest-deep water under fire, forced to wade hundreds of yards while carrying their weapons and equipment, made something tighten in his chest. He turned back to the table and met Smith's eyes. Neither man needed to say what they were both thinking. The plan they had worked so hard to perfect contained a flaw that could not be fixed in the hours they had left. A young staff officer entered with another message. He was careful not to let his voice show the concern he felt. He reported that reconnaissance patrols and the latest aerial photos confirmed the reef was a greater obstacle than earlier estimates had suggested. The tide appeared to be running lower than expected. Turner listened, asked two quiet questions, and then dismissed the officer with a nod. When the door closed, he sat down heavily. Smith spoke first, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who had already imagined the cost. He said that the Marines were ready. They had trained for difficult landings. They would find a way across. Turner nodded, but the nod was not agreement so much as acceptance. They both understood that finding a way would mean young men dying in water that should have been deep enough to protect them. Below decks on the transports, the Marines who would carry out the plan sensed the change in the air even before any official word reached them. The briefings had been thorough in the days leading up to this moment. They had been told what to expect, shown photographs of the beaches, instructed on how to move once they hit the sand. Yet something in the tone of the officers giving those final instructions felt different. There were fewer jokes. The laughter that had carried them across the long voyage was quieter now. Men checked their equipment one more time, adjusted straps that did not need adjusting, and wrote the last letters they would have time to write. The farm boy from Iowa sat on his bunk and tried to finish a letter to his girl. He had started it the night before, telling her about the stars he could see from the deck and how the other fellows were holding up. Now the words would not come easily. He kept thinking about the briefing he had attended that afternoon, about the way the lieutenant had looked when he spoke of the reef and the possibility that they might have to go in on foot. The lieutenant had not used dramatic language. He had simply said that the landing might be more difficult than they had trained for and that every man needed to be ready to improvise. The farm boy folded the unfinished letter and slipped it into his pocket. He would try again later, if there was time. For now he simply sat with the others, listening to the low murmur of voices and the constant sound of the sea against the hull. On the flagship, the tension was quieter but no less real. Turner and Smith reviewed the plan one final time with their key staff. They spoke of the naval gunfire support that would precede the landing, of the airstrikes that would soften the defenses, of the sequence in which the waves would go in. Every detail had been considered. Yet beneath the professional discussion ran an undercurrent of frustration that neither man could fully hide. They had done everything they could with the intelligence they had been given. The reef and the tide had not cooperated with the timetable. Now the only choice left was to proceed and hope that the Marines' training, their courage, and whatever luck the sea might still offer would be enough. A junior officer who had been with Smith since the early days of the division's training stood nearby, listening without speaking. He had seen the general in moments of high pressure before, but this felt different. There was a weariness in Smith's face that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the look of a man who understood that no matter how carefully he had prepared his men, some of them would not survive the first hour because of factors no amount of training could overcome. The young officer thought about the Marines he knew personally, the ones who had joked with him during the long voyage, the ones who had asked quiet questions about what to expect. He thought about how many of those faces might not be there when the sun rose again. He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. He simply made sure the latest maps and overlays were ready and waited for whatever order would come next. As darkness settled over the fleet, the final preparations continued. On the transports, Marines moved through the crowded compartments in a kind of organized quiet. They checked their weapons, adjusted their packs, and made sure their lifebelts were secure. Some wrote letters by the dim light of battle lanterns. Others simply sat with their thoughts, staring at nothing. The religious services that had been held earlier in the day had left a lingering sense of solemnity. Men who rarely spoke about faith had bowed their heads. Some had prayed for the first time in years. The chaplain had moved among them afterward, offering a word or a hand on the shoulder to anyone who seemed to need it. Those small gestures mattered more than anyone could measure in the hours before the landing. On the flagship, Turner made the final decision. The landing would proceed as scheduled. There was no practical way to delay without risking the entire operation and the larger timetable it supported. The gunfire support ships would do everything they could to suppress the defenses. The airstrikes would hit their targets. The Marines would have to do the rest. Smith accepted the decision without argument. He had already begun thinking about how to adjust once the first reports came back from the beach. Both men understood that the flaw in the plan, the lower tide, the exposed reef, would turn what should have been a relatively protected approach into something far more dangerous. They also understood that the men in the first waves would bear the heaviest cost of that danger. The farm boy from Iowa finally finished his letter. It was short. He told his girl that he loved her and that he was thinking of her. He did not mention the reef or the tide or the quiet conversations he had overheard among the officers. He simply signed his name, sealed the envelope, and handed it to the mail clerk with the others. Then he returned to his bunk and lay back, staring at the metal above him. Around him, other men did the same. Some slept fitfully. Others stared into the darkness, listening to the sound of the sea and the distant, steady thrum of the engines. The long voyage across the Pacific was over. The waiting was almost over. What came next would be decided not by planners in a compartment filled with maps, but by the men who would soon climb down the cargo nets into the waiting landing craft and head toward a shore they could not yet see. In the quiet hours before dawn, the commanders on the flagship and the Marines on the transports shared something they could not name. It was not quite fear and not quite resignation. It was the heavy understanding that even the best plans carried hidden flaws, and that young men would pay for those flaws with their lives. The tide had not cooperated. The reef would not yield easily. The only thing left was to go forward and hope that courage, training, and whatever fortune the morning might still hold would be enough to carry them through the first terrible hours. The ships moved slowly into their final positions. The sea remained calm. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the coral beaches waited. The men who had spent months shaping this operation and the men who would carry it out were bound together by more than orders. They were bound by the knowledge that in war, even small miscalculations could change everything. The flaw in the plan was not born of carelessness. It was born of the limits of what could be known from a distance, of the ocean's refusal to follow human timetables, and of the terrible truth that in amphibious warfare, the margin between success and disaster could be measured in inches of water over a reef. As the first pale light began to touch the eastern sky, that margin was about to be tested in the most final way possible. If you want to explore the hidden stories behind operations like this one, the intelligence failures, the secret missions, the forgotten turning points, and the quiet courage that often decided the outcome of entire campaigns, there is a way to go much deeper. Signing up for the free email newsletter will bring you the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with regular deep-dive episodes that uncover the espionage, the hidden heroes, and the moments that changed the course of history in ways most people never hear about. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the first wave of landing craft began to circle in the water, waiting for the signal to head toward the beach, the men inside them could not yet see the reef that would soon rise to meet them. They could not yet know how far they would have to wade or how exposed they would be. They only knew that the moment they had trained for, traveled for, and prepared for in every way they could was finally here. The commanders who had sent them forward carried the weight of the decision they had made. The Marines who would execute it carried only their weapons, their training, and the quiet determination to do whatever the day required. The tide had changed everything. Now the only thing left was to find out whether courage and resolve would be enough to overcome what the planners had not been able to foresee. The first boats turned toward the distant line of surf, and the long approach began. The sky and sea erupted together in a single, shattering roar, and for one brief, terrible moment it seemed as if the small coral island itself might simply cease to exist beneath the weight of fire being poured upon it. From the decks of the transports, the Marines watched in a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction as the battleships and cruisers opened fire. The big guns flashed in the early light, and seconds later the sound reached them, a deep, rolling thunder that vibrated through the hulls and into their chests. Columns of smoke and dirt climbed into the sky over the atoll. The island disappeared behind a curtain of explosions. Some of the men cheered quietly at first, then louder as the bombardment grew in intensity. It felt, for those watching, like justice being delivered from a distance. The long voyage across the Pacific, the cramped days at sea, the quiet fears they had carried, all of it seemed justified by the sheer power now being unleashed on the enemy positions. One Marine from the Midwest leaned against the rail and muttered to the man beside him that nothing could still be alive under that much steel. The other man nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the smoke. He had seen what Japanese defenses could look like up close in an earlier campaign. He said nothing about his doubt. On the battleships, the gunners worked in a different kind of intensity. The turrets swung, the massive barrels elevated, and the recoil shook the entire vessel each time a broadside was fired. Sweat ran down faces blackened by smoke and cordite. The men moved with practiced rhythm, loading, aiming, firing, reloading. There was little time for reflection in the noise and heat of the gun decks. Yet in the brief pauses between salvos, some of them glanced toward the distant shore and thought about the young Marines who would soon be climbing into landing craft. One chief petty officer, a veteran of earlier Pacific actions, paused long enough to wipe his face with a rag that had once been white. He had fired on enemy positions before. He knew how much punishment reinforced concrete and coral could absorb. He also knew that the men going ashore would still have to finish whatever the guns left behind. He said a quiet word to the young sailor working beside him, not about the battle, but about the coffee that would be waiting when this was over. The younger man managed a tired smile. Small kindnesses like that kept the work moving when the noise and the smell of burning propellant threatened to overwhelm everything else. Above the atoll, the aircraft came in wave after wave. Pilots pushed their planes into steep dives, released their bombs, and pulled out hard, feeling the shock waves from their own ordnance. From the cockpits, the island looked like a living thing writhing under the assault. Smoke rose in thick columns. Fires burned along the beaches. The pilots could not see the men huddled inside the bunkers far below. They could only see the results of their bombs and hope that the damage was as complete as it appeared from the air. One young pilot, on his way back to the carrier after his run, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The target had been marked clearly. The anti-aircraft fire had been lighter than expected. It looked, from where he sat, as though the defenses had been shattered. He would learn later how wrong that impression had been. Inside the bunkers and tunnels carved into the coral, the Japanese defenders endured something no one on the ships or in the aircraft could fully imagine. The sound inside those reinforced positions was not the clean roar heard from a distance. It was a continuous, bone-deep hammering that made the air itself seem to shake. Dust and fragments of coral sifted down from the ceilings. Men pressed themselves against the walls or lay flat on the floors, hands over their ears, mouths open to equalize the pressure. Some prayed. Some simply endured in silence, eyes closed, waiting for the next shell to land closer. An officer moved among his men in one of the larger command positions, speaking calmly, reminding them that the concrete and coral above their heads had been built to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he checked the positions of his subordinates. He had spent months helping to design and build these defenses. He had believed they would hold. Now he was testing that belief with his own life and the lives of every man under his command. The bombardment continued for what felt like hours. On the transports, the initial excitement among the Marines gave way to a more complicated feeling. The island was still there. Through breaks in the smoke they could see the shape of it, the long pier, the airfield, the dark lines of what had once been palm trees. The cheering stopped. Men began to watch more carefully. Some of them had been told that the naval gunfire and airstrikes would destroy the defenses, that the landing would be almost unopposed once the bombardment lifted. Now, as the smoke began to clear in places, they saw that the island had not been erased. It had been battered, yes. But it was still there, still waiting. A quiet unease settled over some of the waiting men. They checked their equipment again, adjusted straps, and tried not to think too hard about what might still be alive inside those bunkers. On one of the command ships, the officers monitoring the bombardment exchanged glances as reports came in from the spotting planes. The damage appeared extensive on the surface. The beaches were cratered. Many of the visible gun positions had been hit. Yet there were also reports of movement in areas that should have been neutralized. The Japanese had built their defenses deep, connected tunnels, thick concrete roofs, positions sunk into the coral itself. The heavy shells and bombs were devastating what could be seen, but they were not reaching everything that had been hidden. The commanders had known this was possible. They had studied the intelligence. Still, seeing the reality of it in the moment, watching the island absorb punishment that should have been decisive and yet remained dangerous, brought a fresh weight to the decisions that had already been made. Inside one of the Japanese bunkers, a young soldier sat with his back against the cool coral wall and wrote a few lines in a small notebook by the dim light of a battle lantern. He wrote about the noise, about the way the ground kept shaking, about how he kept thinking of his family's small farm and the sound of rain on the roof instead of shells. He did not write about fear. He wrote instead about the men around him who had not moved or spoken for a long time, and about the officer who kept walking the tunnel, speaking to each man in turn. When the bombardment finally began to slacken, the soldier closed the notebook and put it away. He checked his rifle, adjusted his helmet, and waited with the others for whatever would come next. As the last of the heavy gunfire lifted and the aircraft turned away for the final time, a strange quiet fell over the atoll. Smoke still rose from dozens of fires. The beaches were scarred and cratered. From the transports, the Marines could see the damage clearly now. It looked, at first glance, as though nothing could have survived. Yet the quiet itself felt wrong. There were no secondary explosions from ammunition stores being hit. There was no visible movement of defenders abandoning ruined positions. The island simply waited, battered but not broken. The Marines began to climb down into the landing craft. The boats circled in the water, waiting for the signal to head toward the beach. On the decks of the transports, men who had watched the bombardment now prepared to go forward into whatever had survived it. Some of them still carried a thread of hope that the guns and bombs had done their work. Others had already let that hope go. They had seen too much of the island still standing. They knew that the real test would begin the moment their boats grounded on the reef or reached the shore. The bombardment had been awesome in its power. It had shaken the atoll and lit the sky. It had given the waiting Marines a sense that the worst might already be over. But the false promise of that roar was already becoming clear to those who understood what they were seeing. The Japanese defenders had built their positions to survive exactly this kind of assault. Many of them had lived through the fire. They were still in their tunnels and bunkers, still manning their weapons, still waiting for the men in the landing craft to come within range. The roar had shaken the atoll, but it had not broken the will or the defenses of those who had endured it from below. The first boats turned toward the distant beach. The smoke was beginning to drift. The island lay waiting under the morning light, scarred but still dangerous. And the men who had watched the bombardment from the ships now moved forward into the silence that followed, carrying with them the fragile hope that the guns had done enough and the growing understanding that they had not. If you want to see the raw power of those Pacific bombardments and the human courage on both sides brought to life with remarkable intensity, Amazon offers a thoughtfully curated collection of World War II memorabilia, from detailed ship models and historical volumes to authentic pieces that let you hold a small part of that era in your hands. And if you want to experience the tension, the leadership, and the visceral reality of the Pacific campaign on screen, the powerful film Midway on Prime Video captures the spirit of those battles and the men who fought them with gripping authenticity. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the landing craft began their long, slow approach across the lagoon, the men inside could still smell the smoke drifting from the island. Some of them looked back toward the battleships that had fired the great guns. Others kept their eyes forward, watching the line of surf grow closer. The bombardment had ended. The false promise of total destruction had already begun to fade. What remained was the island itself, battered, smoking, but still waiting, and the men who would have to cross the final stretch of water to reach it. The roar had shaken everything. Now the real work, the work no amount of gunfire could finish, was about to begin. The boats grounded hard on the hidden reef far from shore, and the men who had expected to ride safely to the beach now stepped down into water that would turn every yard into a separate battle for their lives. The landing craft had circled in the lagoon after the bombardment lifted, engines idling while the Marines inside checked their weapons one last time and tried to steady their breathing. The smoke from the island still drifted across the water, but through the haze they could see the dark line of the beach and the shapes of buildings beyond it. For a moment it looked almost possible. The plan had always been that the boats would carry them all the way in, that the reef would be covered by the tide and the defenses would be shattered. Now, as the first wave turned toward the shore, the water grew suddenly shallow. The boats scraped and jolted to a stop. The ramps dropped, and the men who had been sitting shoulder to shoulder found themselves looking out at hundreds of yards of open water between them and the narrow strip of sand they had come so far to reach. The farm boy from Iowa was near the front of his boat. He had spent the last minutes of the approach thinking about the letter he had written the night before, the one still tucked in his pocket. When the ramp went down, he stepped into water that came up to his waist, then higher as he moved forward. His pack and rifle felt twice as heavy once they were wet. Around him other men were doing the same, some cursing, some silent, all of them moving because there was no other choice. The first machine gun fire reached them before they had gone 20 yards. It came in short, vicious bursts from positions that had survived the bombardment. Men began to fall. Some went under the surface immediately, pulled down by the weight of their gear. Others struggled forward, heads barely above the water, trying to keep their rifles dry and their balance against the incoming fire. On the narrow beach that was their only possible cover, the first men who reached it found almost no protection. The sand was flat and exposed. The only real shelter was a low sea wall and a few scattered piles of logs and debris. They crawled or ran the last few yards and threw themselves down, chests heaving, water streaming from their uniforms. One Marine from the city, the quick-handed kid from Philadelphia, had lost his helmet somewhere in the wade. He kept moving anyway, staying low, using his hands to pull himself forward when the current and the weight of his soaked pack tried to drag him under. He reached another man who had been hit in the shoulder and was struggling to keep his head above water. Without thinking, the Philadelphia kid grabbed him under the arms and half-dragged, half-carried him the last stretch to the beach. They collapsed together behind the low wall. Neither of them spoke. There was no breath for words yet. The kid simply pressed his hand against the wound to slow the bleeding and waited for the next wave of men to reach them. Farther out in the water, the chaos was worse. Landing craft that had grounded on the reef were now sitting targets. Some took direct hits from artillery that had also survived the earlier bombardment. Others simply could not move forward or back. Men jumped from them into deeper water than they had expected, went under, and fought their way up again. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon, the one who had kept the notebook through the long voyage, found himself in water up to his chest with his rifle held high over his head. He had always been quiet, observant. Now he moved with a strange, deliberate calm, placing each foot carefully on the coral bottom so he would not stumble. Around him men were shouting for corpsmen, for help, for their mothers. He kept moving because stopping felt like surrender. When he reached a man who had been hit in the leg and could no longer walk, he slung his own rifle across his back, took the wounded Marine's arm over his shoulder, and began the slow, agonizing walk toward the beach. The weight of 2 men in soaked uniforms and gear was almost more than he could manage. Twice he went under himself. Each time he came up still holding the other man, still moving. The Japanese fire was steady and accurate. It came from positions that had been hidden and reinforced so well that the naval guns and bombs had not reached them. Machine guns swept the water in long, methodical bursts. Mortars and artillery added their own deadly rhythm. The men in the water had almost no cover and almost no way to return effective fire while they were still waiting. Some tried to shoot from the hip as they moved. Most simply kept their heads down and kept walking, one step at a time, toward the only safety they could see. The distance that had looked manageable from the boats now felt endless. Every yard was a separate act of will. On one of the grounded landing craft, a young lieutenant stood on the ramp and shouted encouragement to the men still inside. He had been wounded in the arm during the approach but had refused to stay behind. When his own boat could go no farther, he jumped into the water with the others. Now he moved up and down the line of struggling Marines, helping those who were having trouble with their packs, pulling men who had gone under back to the surface. His voice carried over the noise of the guns and the water. He told them to keep moving, that the beach was close, that they were almost there. A machine gun burst caught him in the chest while he was helping another man. He went down without a sound. The men around him hesitated for only a second, then kept going because stopping would have meant dying in the same place. One of them, a big Marine from Texas who had been quiet through most of the voyage, picked up the lieutenant's carbine and continued forward, firing as he waited. The corpsmen were everywhere and nowhere at once. They moved through the water with medical bags held high, trying to reach the wounded before the current or the fire could take them. One corpsman from a small town in the Midwest had already treated 3 men in the first few minutes after reaching the shallows. He worked with steady hands even while bullets kicked up spray around him. When he reached a Marine who had been hit in the stomach and was floating face down, he turned him over, cleared his airway, and began the long, slow pull toward the beach. The wounded man was conscious enough to grip the corpsman's sleeve. They did not speak. The only sound between them was the ragged breathing of both men and the constant crack of gunfire. By the time the first waves had struggled onto the narrow strip of sand, the beach was already crowded with the living, the wounded, and the dead. Men lay in shallow depressions or pressed against the low sea wall, trying to catch their breath and make sense of what had just happened. The plan had called for a rapid advance inland once they reached the shore. Instead, they were pinned against the water's edge with almost no room to maneuver and with more waves still coming in behind them. The farm boy from Iowa sat with his back against the sea wall, water still dripping from his uniform, and watched another boat ground on the reef. He saw the men in it begin the same long walk he had just finished. Some of them made it. Some did not. He looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking. He had not felt the shaking while he was in the water. Now that he was on solid ground, the fear he had pushed aside came rushing back for a moment. Then he saw another man nearby who had been hit in the leg and was trying to tie a bandage with one hand. The farm boy moved over without thinking and helped tie the knot. The small act of helping someone else steadied him more than anything else could have. The Philadelphia kid was still pressing his hand against the shoulder wound of the man he had dragged in. He kept talking in a low, steady voice, telling the wounded Marine that he was going to be all right, that help was coming, that they had made it to the beach. The words were as much for himself as for the other man. Around them, the first attempts to push inland were already beginning. Small groups of Marines rose from the sand and moved toward the nearest cover, only to be met by more fire from positions that had not been silenced. They went to ground again, crawling from one bit of shelter to the next. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon finally reached the beach with the wounded man still leaning on him. He lowered the other Marine gently to the sand and then simply sat for a moment, breathing hard, water running from his uniform in streams. He had lost his notebook somewhere in the lagoon. He did not have time to think about that now. He checked his rifle, made sure it would still fire, and looked for the next place he was needed. The long walk through the fire had already cost more than anyone on the transports had imagined when they watched the bombardment. The reef had turned what was supposed to be a protected approach into an open killing ground. The Japanese defenders who had survived underground were now firing from positions that gave them clear fields of fire across the water and the narrow beach. Every man who had made it to shore carried the memory of that walk with him. Some would carry physical wounds as well. All of them would carry the knowledge that the careful plans made weeks earlier had met the reality of the reef and the tide and had not survived the meeting. Yet even in the middle of the chaos there were the small, stubborn acts that kept men moving. A Marine who had lost his weapon helped another man carry ammunition forward. Two men who had never spoken more than a few words to each other during the voyage now worked together to pull a third man out of the surf. A corpsman who had already used most of his supplies tore strips from his own shirt to make bandages. These were not the actions of heroes in stories. They were the ordinary responses of ordinary young men who had been placed in an impossible situation and were doing the only thing they could think of, taking care of the man next to them. The sun was climbing higher. The smoke from the bombardment was drifting away. The narrow beach was crowded with men who had survived the longest walk of their lives so far. More boats were still coming in, still grounding on the reef, still sending men into the water under fire. The invasion had begun, but it had not begun the way anyone had planned. The deadly reef had seen to that. And the men who had crossed it were only beginning to understand what the rest of the day would ask of them. If you want to see the unflinching reality of what these men endured in those first terrible minutes, the chaos in the water, the courage under fire, the raw human cost that no words can fully capture, there is a collection that shows it without softening or censorship. The exclusive Gumroad archive contains rare, uncensored photographs and footage from Tarawa and the wider Pacific campaign, material too graphic and honest for most platforms to host. These images let you witness the true face of that long walk through fire in a way that brings the story closer than any description alone can manage. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As more men reached the narrow strip of sand and tried to organize themselves for the next push, the beach became a place of desperate improvisation. Wounded were dragged to whatever shelter could be found. Ammunition was passed from hand to hand. Small groups formed and moved inland a few yards at a time before being forced down again by fire. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia Kid, the thoughtful Marine from Oregon, and thousands of others like them were no longer simply waiting for orders. They were surviving minute by minute, helping one another when they could, and carrying forward the only plan that still mattered, the one that said keep moving, keep fighting, and do not leave the man beside you behind. The deadly reef had already taken its toll. The real battle for the island was only just beginning. In the middle of the slaughter on that narrow strip of sand, one man stood up, blood soaking through his uniform, and refused to move from the spot he had chosen. Colonel David Shoup had come ashore with the early waves, limping from a wound that would have sent most men to the rear. Instead, he moved through the chaos like a steady point of reference in a storm. The beach was a mess of scattered groups, wounded men calling for help, and the constant crack of fire from positions that had never been silenced. Landing craft were still grinding onto the reef behind them, sending more men into the water under the same deadly fire. Shoup found a wrecked landing craft near the pier and made it his command post. He propped himself against the twisted metal, radio in one hand, pistol in the other, and began the work of turning a collapsing situation into something that could still be held. Around him, the men who had survived the long walk through the water were trying to make sense of what had happened. The farm boy from Iowa crouched nearby, reloading his rifle with hands that still trembled from the weight. He had seen officers before, but none like this. Shoup spoke in a calm, carrying voice that cut through the noise without shouting. He told a group of scattered Marines to gather what ammunition they could find and move to the left flank where the fire was heaviest. When one young private hesitated, frozen by the sight of so many bodies in the water behind them, Shoup looked at him directly and said, "We're staying right here. The only way off this beach is forward." The private nodded, picked up his rifle, and moved. Later the farm boy would remember that moment as the one that kept him from breaking. Shoup's wound was in his leg, and every step cost him. He did not favor it much. He simply moved from one small group to another, assessing, directing, steadying. A runner brought word that the left flank was in danger of being rolled up. Shoop listened, asked one quiet question about how many men were still able to fight, then sent the runner back with orders to hold and that naval gunfire support would be coming. He did not promise miracles. He promised only that he was not going anywhere and that every man who could still pull a trigger had a job to do. The runner left at a crouching run, and Shoop turned to the next problem. The Philadelphia Kid had dragged his wounded comrade behind the low sea wall and was still pressing a hand against the shoulder wound when Shoop appeared. The colonel took in the situation with a glance, then knelt beside the injured man. He spoke to him directly, asking his name and where he was from. The wounded Marine managed a weak answer. Shoop nodded as if they were meeting under ordinary circumstances and told him help was coming. Then he looked at the Philadelphia Kid and said, "You did good getting him this far. Now stay with him until the corpsman finds you. After that I need you on your feet." The kid nodded. Something in Shoop's voice made the order feel less like a command and more like a shared understanding between men who both knew what had to be done. Later, when the corpsman arrived and the Philadelphia Kid was free to move, he found himself looking for Shoop in the confusion, wanting to report back as if that single conversation had made him part of something larger than his own survival. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon had reached the beach with the man he had helped from the water. He sat for a moment catching his breath, then began checking his rifle and looking for a place where he could be useful. Shoop found him there. The colonel asked if he could still fight. The Oregon Marine said he could. Shoop told him to gather any men nearby who were not already assigned and move toward a cluster of wrecked boats that offered some cover. He spoke without drama, as if he were giving directions to a work detail back home. The Oregon Marine later wrote in his mind the words he would have put in his notebook if he still had it. He made it sound possible. That was the miracle. Shoop's radio crackled constantly. He called for naval gunfire on specific targets, adjusted fire when the shells landed too close to his own men, and coordinated with whatever officers he could reach. The communications were often broken or delayed. He worked with what he had. When a runner reported that one position was running low on ammunition, Shoop sent word to the beach party to bring forward whatever crates could be salvaged from the wrecked boats. When another runner said the Japanese were probing the right flank, Shoop moved there himself, limping through the open ground, to see the situation with his own eyes. He did not send someone else to do what he could do himself. The men who saw him moving under fire began to move with more purpose themselves. Fear did not disappear, but it became something they could carry while still doing their jobs. There were moments of small humanity in the middle of the fight. Shoop shared a canteen with a Marine whose own water had been lost in the surf. He listened for 30 seconds while another man spoke of his wife and child back home, then gently told him to save the story for when they were off the beach. He made sure a wounded man was moved to what little shade existed before he turned to the next crisis. These were not grand gestures. They were the steady actions of a man who understood that leadership in such a place was as much about preserving the humanity of the men around him as it was about tactics. The farm boy from Iowa watched Shoop do these things and felt something shift inside himself. The terror of the Wade was still there, but now it was mixed with a stubborn determination to be worthy of the man who refused to leave. As the day wore on, the scattered groups began to connect. What had been isolated pockets of survival became something closer to a line. Shoop's command post, such as it was, became the place men looked to when they needed direction. He could not be everywhere at once, but his presence was felt across the narrow beachhead. When naval gunfire finally began to answer his calls more effectively, the men cheered, not because the shells were dramatic, but because someone had managed to make the larger machine work in their favor. Shoop did not cheer. He simply nodded once and went back to the radio. The Philadelphia Kid eventually left his wounded comrade with the corpsman and found a rifle. He moved toward the position Shoop had pointed out earlier. Along the way he helped another man who had twisted an ankle in the coral. They reached the wrecked boats together and added their fire to the thin line that was holding. The kid thought about the way Shoop had spoken to him earlier. There had been no praise, no drama. Just a clear expectation that he would do what needed doing. That expectation had carried him forward when his own fear might have kept him pinned down. The Oregon Marine gathered the men Shoop had sent him to find and moved them into position. He kept his head low and his eyes moving, the way he had learned to do on the long voyage when he watched everything. He thought about the colonel who had been wounded yet still walked the beach as if the outcome depended on his next step. It did, in ways none of them could measure yet. The Oregon Marine made sure each man in his small group knew where the others were and what their fields of fire covered. He did it without being asked because he had seen Shoop do the same thing an hour earlier. By late afternoon the beachhead was still precarious, but it was no longer on the edge of collapse. The men who had survived the reef and the wade had been given something to hold on to. Shoop's steady presence, his refusal to yield ground or to let the situation dissolve into every man for himself, had created a fragile cohesion where none had existed. He was still bleeding. He still limped. He still moved from one crisis to the next without rest. And because he stayed, others stayed with him. The farm boy from Iowa found himself next to Shoop again as the light began to fade. He had been sent to report on the ammunition situation in his sector. Shoop listened, gave new instructions, and then looked at the young Marine for a moment longer than necessary. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. The farm boy nodded. He did not feel fine. He felt exhausted and scared and far from home. But he also felt, for the first time since the ramp had dropped, that he was part of something that might still hold. That feeling had come from the man standing in front of him, wounded and steady, who had chosen to stay right there on the beach when everything else had told him to fall back. Shoop turned back to the radio. The work was not finished. The night would bring its own tests. But the beachhead that should have been lost in the first hours was still in American hands because one man had refused to leave it. The miracle was not in the absence of fear or the absence of loss. The miracle was in the simple, stubborn decision to stay, to organize, to lead, and to believe that the men around him could do the same. That decision had already saved lives. It would save more before the island was taken. If these stories of ordinary men rising to extraordinary moments have stayed with you, and you want to help keep the memory of their courage alive through careful research and honest telling, even the smallest contribution makes a real difference. Supporting this work with a small tip on Ko-Fi, starting at just $1, helps ensure that the sacrifices of men like these are never reduced to numbers or forgotten in the rush of time. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As darkness settled over the narrow beach, the men who had survived the day settled into their positions as best they could. Shoop remained at his makeshift command post, still giving orders, still moving when he needed to, still refusing to yield the ground he had claimed with the lives of so many. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia kid, the thoughtful Marine from Oregon, and hundreds of others like them now had a line to hold and a leader who had shown them that holding it was possible. The long walk through fire had brought them here. Colonel Shoop's refusal to leave had given them a reason to stay. The real test of the beachhead was only beginning, but because one man had stayed right there when everything told him to go, the men around him found the strength to do the same. The long pier stretched into the lagoon like a promise that had turned into a trap, and the men who fought for every foot of it learned that courage was not a single act but a long, bloody series of choices made while friends fell beside them. After the first terrible hours on the narrow beach, the pier became the one place that could change everything. It reached out from the shore into deeper water, offering a way for more landing craft to come in directly once it was secure. Supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements could flow across it instead of struggling through the reef and the fire. The Japanese knew this as well as the Americans did. They had turned the pier and the ground around it into a killing ground of machine guns, mortars, and snipers hidden in wrecked boats and fortified positions. To take it, the Marines would have to move forward in the open, under constant fire, with almost no cover except the bodies of the men who had already fallen. The farm boy from Iowa found himself near the base of the pier with a handful of other men who had survived the wade. His uniform was still wet from the lagoon, and the weight of his pack and rifle pulled at his shoulders with every step. He had seen the Philadelphia Kid earlier, dragging another wounded man to cover, and the sight had stayed with him. Now, as the group began to push along the edge of the pier, he kept his eyes on the man in front of him and tried not to look at the water where more boats were still coming in under fire. The first burst of machine gun fire from a position under the pier itself sent them all to the ground. The farm boy pressed himself flat against the coral and felt the spray from bullets hitting the water inches from his face. He thought of the letter still in his pocket, the one he had written before the ramp dropped, and wondered if anyone would ever read it. Then the man beside him was hit. The farm boy reached out without thinking, grabbed the wounded Marine's harness, and began pulling him back toward a slight depression in the sand. The movement exposed him for only a few seconds, but those seconds felt endless. When he reached cover, he was breathing hard, his hands shaking, but the other man was still alive. A corpsman appeared almost immediately, and the farm boy handed the wounded Marine over with a quiet word he could not later remember. Then he picked up his rifle again and looked toward the pier. The only way forward was through the fire. Farther along the pier, the Philadelphia Kid had found a wrecked landing craft that offered a little shelter. He had already been hit once in the arm during the wade, but the wound was not deep and he had wrapped it with a strip from his shirt. Now he was using the wrecked boat as cover to return fire on a Japanese position that was raking the men trying to advance. His quick hands, the same hands that had once dealt cards on the transport deck, moved with steady precision as he reloaded and fired. Beside him, another Marine was trying to work a light machine gun into position. The gunner was hit before he could get off more than a few bursts. The Philadelphia Kid dragged him back, checked the wound, and then took the machine gun himself. He had never fired one in combat before, but he had watched the gunner set it up. He swung the weapon toward the enemy position and let loose a long burst that silenced the fire for a moment. Around him, other men began to move forward again. He kept firing until the ammunition belt ran out, then picked up his rifle and followed. There was no time to think about what he had just done. There was only the next few yards of open ground and the need to keep the man in front of him alive. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon moved with the same quiet deliberation he had shown on the long voyage. He had lost his notebook in the water, but he still carried the habit of noticing everything. He saw the way the Japanese fire came in patterns, the way the men who moved too fast drew more attention, and the way small groups working together had a better chance than lone runners. He stayed close to two other Marines he had met on the beach, and together they advanced by short rushes, one man firing while the others moved. When one of them was hit in the leg, the Oregon Marine and the third man carried him the last stretch to a pile of debris that offered cover. The wounded man was in pain but conscious. He asked them not to leave him. They told him they would not. The Oregon Marine used his own shirt to make a better bandage, then took the wounded man's rifle and continued forward with the other Marine. He did not speak much. He simply did what needed doing, one careful step at a time, the same way he had crossed the lagoon. Colonel Shoup's presence from the earlier hours still reached them in fragments. Runners moved back and forth carrying messages, and every time word came that the beachhead was still holding, the men fighting for the pier found a little more strength. Shoup had sent word that the pier was critical, that if they could secure even part of it, the flow of supplies and men would change everything. The farm boy heard one of those messages and felt the weight of it settle on him. He was no longer just surviving his own stretch of water and sand. He was part of something larger, something that might still turn the day if enough men kept moving. The fighting along the pier was close and merciless. Japanese positions under the structure itself fired upward through gaps in the planking. Snipers and wrecked boats along the shore picked off men who exposed themselves for even a second. Mortar rounds landed in the water and on the sand, sending up plumes of spray and coral dust. The men advanced by crawling, by short rushes, by dragging themselves forward when they could no longer stand. Every few yards they paid a price. A Marine who had been laughing with his buddies on the transport the night before now lay still in the shallow water. Another who had helped carry ammunition across the reef took a burst across the chest and fell without a sound. The Philadelphia kid saw it happen and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had no time to grieve. He kept moving because stopping would have meant joining the dead. There were moments of raw courage that no one planned and no one would ever fully record. One man stood up in the open to draw fire so his squad could move. He was hit almost immediately but kept firing until he could no longer hold his rifle. Another Marine, already wounded in the side, crawled under the pier itself to silence a machine gun position that was holding up the advance. He reached the gun, threw a grenade, and was killed by the blast, but the position fell silent long enough for the others to push past. These were not stories told with fanfare. They were simply what happened when ordinary young men were given no choice but to do the impossible or watch their friends die. The farm boy from Iowa reached a point where the pier met a cluster of wrecked boats. He and two other men used the wreckage for cover and began clearing the Japanese positions one by one. It was brutal, close work. Grenades were thrown into small openings. Rifle fire was exchanged at ranges so short that the men could see each other's faces. The farm boy felt a bullet tug at his sleeve and kept firing. When one of the men beside him was hit in the shoulder, he pulled him back and applied pressure to the wound while the third man covered them. The wounded Marine looked at him and said, "Don't stop. Keep going." The farm boy nodded. He finished bandaging the wound as best he could, picked up his rifle, and moved forward again. The small act of helping someone else had steadied him more than he expected. By the time the sun began to drop, the Marines had gained a foothold along part of the pier. It was not secure in the way the planners had hoped. Japanese fire still swept parts of it, and movement remained dangerous. But it was enough to begin bringing in some supplies and to evaluate some of the wounded who could be reached. The Philadelphia kid helped carry a wounded man across the section they had taken. The Oregon Marine found himself directing a small group of replacements who had just come in from a later wave, showing them where to take cover and how to move without drawing fire. The farm boy sat for a moment behind a wrecked boat, breathing hard, and realized his hands had stopped shaking. He was exhausted, thirsty, and covered in coral dust and blood that was not all his own. But he was still moving. The pier had become a crucible. It had tested every man who stepped onto it or fought beside it. It had taken lives without mercy and had rewarded courage with nothing more than the chance to keep fighting. Yet because the men had kept moving, because they had helped one another when every instinct told them to save themselves, the narrow strip of wood and coral had begun to serve its purpose. More landing craft could now approach closer. More ammunition and water could reach the men who were still pinned on the beach. The cost had been terrible. The gain was real. The emotional weight of the day settled on the survivors as darkness came. They had watched friends fall in the water and on the sand. They had seen men perform acts of bravery that would never be remembered by anyone except the men who had been there. They had learned that in this kind of fighting, leadership was not only about colonels giving orders. It was also about the private who pulled a wounded buddy to cover, the kid who took over a machine gun, the quiet man who kept moving one careful step at a time. Those small, stubborn choices had held the pier long enough for something larger to begin. If the raw courage and the terrible cost of fights like this one have moved you, and you want to go deeper into the unfiltered human stories of World War II, the conversations that happened in the middle of the fire, the quiet acts that never made the official reports, the full truth behind the headlines, there is a place where that deeper connection is waiting. The Patreon community for history lovers offers uncensored extended podcasts, raw video segments, and a welcoming circle of fellow enthusiasts who believe these individual lives deserve to be remembered completely and honestly. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As night settled over the atoll, the men who had fought for the pier settled into whatever cover they could find. Some wrote quick notes by the light of shielded flashlights, trying to capture what they had seen before memory softened the edges. Others simply sat in silence, sharing a canteen or a cigarette when they had one to spare. The farm boy from Iowa leaned against the wreckage of a boat and thought about the man he had helped earlier. He did not know if that man would live through the night. He only knew that he had done what he could. The Philadelphia kid cleaned his rifle with steady hands, the same hands that had once dealt cards to pass the time on the transport. The Oregon Marine kept watch, noticing the patterns of the night and the way the Japanese fire had lessened but not stopped. They were no longer the same young men who had stepped off the boats that morning. The pier had changed them. The cost had been high, and the fight was far from over, but because they had kept moving through the fire, because they had refused to leave one another behind, the long wooden finger reaching into the lagoon was no longer only a trap. It was becoming a bridge, one bloody plank at a time, toward whatever the next day would demand of them. As the last light bled from the sky over the battered atoll, the men who had fought all day found themselves swallowed by a darkness that turned every shadow into a threat and every whisper into a lifeline. The island that had already demanded so much now offered no mercy in the night. The Marines who had clawed their way onto the narrow beach and fought for the pier were exhausted, wounded, and scattered in shallow holes they had scraped from the coral with helmets and bare hands. There was no time for deep foxholes or proper defensive positions. The ground was too hard, the enemy too close, and the day had already taken too many lives. They lay in the dark with their rifles ready, listening to the sounds of the lagoon and the distant murmur of the sea, waiting for whatever the Japanese would send against them. The farm boy from Iowa pressed his back against the low lip of the hole he shared with two other men. His uniform was stiff with salt and coral dust, and the wound on his arm from earlier in the day throbbed with every heartbeat. He had not slept in more than a day, but sleep was impossible now. Every rustle in the darkness made his grip tighten on his rifle. Beside him, one of the other Marines whispered that he could hear movement out beyond the wire they had strung in the last light. The farm boy nodded even though no one could see him. He thought of the letter still in his pocket, the one he had written before the landing, and wondered if he would ever have the chance to add another line. In the quiet between sounds, he reached into his canteen and passed it to the man on his left without being asked. The other Marine took a small sip and passed it back. That simple exchange, the feel of another hand in the dark, was enough to steady him for a little while longer. A few yards away, the Philadelphia kid lay in his own shallow scrape with two men he had only met that afternoon. His wounded arm was bandaged but aching, and he kept his good hand near his rifle. The night had turned the island into something unfamiliar. The shapes he had seen in daylight were now black voids. He listened to the soft scrape of coral under boots somewhere out in front of them and knew it was not one of their own. When the first probing attack came, it was almost silent at first, just shadows moving low against the ground. The Philadelphia kid waited until he could make out the shape of a helmet, then fired. The flash from his rifle lit the darkness for a split second, and in that moment he saw the face of the man he had shot. It was not hatred that filled him afterward. It was a cold, heavy feeling that this was what the day had come to, killing in the dark because there was no other choice. One of the men beside him whispered thanks for the quick shot. The Philadelphia kid did not answer. He simply reloaded and kept listening. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon had found a slight rise near the edge of what had once been part of the airfield. He shared the position with three other men, including one who had been with him since the pier fight. They had piled what little cover they could find, wrecked equipment, sandbags, anything that might stop a bullet. The Oregon Marine kept his eyes moving even though there was little to see. He had always noticed details, and in the dark those details became sounds and the feel of the air. He heard the faint click of metal on coral somewhere to their left and touched the arm of the man next to him. They waited together in silence until a shadow rose from the ground. The attack came in a rush, short, vicious, and aimed at breaking through the thin line. The Oregon Marine fired steadily, aiming at the sounds and the shapes that moved against the slightly lighter sky. When one of his companions was hit, he dragged the man back into the shallow hole and pressed a field dressing against the wound while the other two kept firing. The wounded Marine gripped his sleeve and whispered that he did not want to die in the dark. The Oregon Marine told him he would not, even though he had no way of knowing if it was true. He stayed with him until the corpsman could reach them, then returned to the line because there was no one else to take his place. Colonel Shoup's steady presence from the daylight hours still reached them in fragments. Runners moved carefully between positions, carrying orders and what little news there was. Word came that the beachhead was holding, that the pier was still in their hands, and that Shoup himself was still moving among the men despite his wound. The knowledge that someone was still in charge, still refusing to yield, gave the men in the hole something to hold on to. The farm boy heard one of those messages and felt the exhaustion in his bones ease just a little. He was not alone out here. None of them were. The Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night, sometimes small groups of infiltrators slipping through gaps in the line, sometimes larger rushes meant to overwhelm a section and roll it up. The darkness made everything worse. Men could not see their targets clearly. They fired at sounds and at movement, and sometimes they fired at their own. A Marine a few positions down from the Philadelphia Kid was hit by friendly fire when he stood up to throw a grenade. The man who had fired called out in horror, and the Philadelphia Kid heard the raw grief in his voice even over the noise of the fight. In the dark there was no time for blame. There was only the need to keep the line from breaking. Small acts of humanity kept surfacing between the moments of terror. The farm boy shared the last of his water with the man who had been hit earlier in the night. The Philadelphia Kid helped another Marine reload when his hands were shaking too badly to manage the clip. The Oregon Marine whispered a story about his home in the quiet between attacks, not for himself, but because he could feel the fear rising in the man next to him. The story was ordinary: rain on a roof, the sound of a train in the distance, the way his mother used to call him in from the yard. It did not change the darkness or the danger, but for a few minutes it gave the other man something else to hold in his mind. There were moments of raw courage that no one would ever write down in official reports. A Marine who had already been wounded twice crawled out into the open to pull a fallen comrade back to cover. He was hit again before he reached safety, but the man he saved lived through the night. Another Marine, alone in a shallow hole after his companions were killed, held his position against a probing attack by throwing grenades and firing until his ammunition was gone, then using his rifle as a club when the enemy came close. He was found at dawn still gripping the broken weapon. These were not stories of glory. They were stories of men who refused to let the night take everything from them. The psychological toll of fighting in the dark settled heavily on everyone who survived until morning. The constant tension, the inability to see what was coming, the knowledge that the enemy could be anywhere, it wore men down in ways the daylight fighting had not. Some whispered prayers they had not spoken since childhood. Others simply held their rifles tighter and waited for the next sound. The bonds that had formed during the long voyage and the terrible day on the beach grew stronger in the darkness. Men who had barely known each other's names now shared their last cigarettes, their last sips of water, and the quiet words that kept fear from turning into panic. As the hours crawled toward dawn, the attacks began to slacken. The Japanese had tested the line everywhere and found it still holding, though barely in some places. The Marines who remained in their shallow positions were hollow-eyed and shaking with exhaustion, but they had not broken. The farm boy from Iowa sat with his back against the coral and listened to the sound of the sea. He thought about the men who had not made it through the night and about the ones who had. The Philadelphia kid cleaned his rifle by feel in the dark, his steady hands moving through the familiar motions even though he could not see what he was doing. The Oregon Marine kept watch until the sky began to lighten, noticing the way the shadows changed and the way the first pale light touched the water. When dawn finally came, it revealed the cost of the night in stark detail. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Wounded men called for help in voices that were raw from shouting. The line had held, but only just. The beachhead that Colonel Shoup had refused to abandon was still in American hands. The pier that had been fought for so desperately was still there. The men who had survived the darkness had done so through courage, through luck, and through the small, stubborn acts of looking after one another when everything else told them to save themselves. The night had swallowed the island, but it had not swallowed the will of the men who held their ground in the dark. They had faced the terror that came after the sun went down, and they had endured. What they had gained in those hours was more than ground. It was the knowledge that they could hold together even when they could not see what was coming. That knowledge would carry them into the next day and the days after, as the fight for the atoll continued under a sun that would show them everything they had already lost and everything they still had to give. If the hidden courage and the quiet bonds that formed in the darkness of that first night have stayed with you, and you want to explore the deeper, often unseen stories of World War II, the secret operations, the forgotten turning points, and the individual acts of resilience that shaped the outcome of entire campaigns, there is a way to go much further. Signing up for the free email newsletter will bring you the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with regular deep dive episodes that uncover the espionage, the hidden heroes, and the moments that changed history in ways most people never hear about. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the sun rose over the atoll, the men who had held through the night began to move again. Some tended to the wounded. Others checked their weapons and prepared for whatever the new day would bring. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia kid, and the thoughtful Marine from Oregon were still there, changed by what they had endured but still standing. The island had tried to swallow them in the dark, but they had refused to disappear. The fight was far from over, yet in the pale morning light there was a fragile sense that something had been won, not territory, but the knowledge that ordinary young men, pushed to the edge of what they could bear, could still find the strength to hold on to one another and to the ground they had paid so dearly to reach. Dawn broke over the battered atoll not with relief but with the same grinding fire that had defined every hour since the first boats grounded, and the men who had clawed through the night now faced a new day that asked them to keep moving forward when their bodies and spirits had already given everything they thought they had. The shallow holes they had scraped from the coral offered almost no protection from the morning light or the Japanese positions that had survived the darkness. Exhaustion hung over the beachhead like a second skin. Men who had fought through the wade, the pier, and the terror of infiltration attacks now moved with stiff limbs and eyes that had seen too much. Some had not slept at all. Others had drifted into brief, haunted dozes only to wake to the sound of renewed firing. Fresh waves of Marines were coming in from the lagoon, using the section of pier that had been secured the day before, bringing ammunition, water, and the grim knowledge that the fight was far from over. The farm boy from Iowa sat with his back against a low pile of debris, his wounded arm throbbing and his uniform stiff with dried salt and dust. He had survived the night by staying low and firing at shadows, but the cost was written on the faces around him. The man he had shared his canteen with in the dark was gone, hid during one of the last probing attacks. The farm boy had dragged him back as far as he could, but there had been no corpsman close enough in time. Now he looked at the rising sun and felt a wave of something heavier than tiredness settle over him. He thought of the fields back home, of the simple rhythm of work that had once defined his days, and wondered how he had come so far from that life in such a short time. When a runner came through with word that they were to push inland and link up with other groups, the farm boy stood without complaint. His legs ached and his head felt thick, but the alternative was to stay where they were and wait for the enemy to come again. He checked his rifle, accepted a fresh bandolier of ammunition from a man he did not know, and moved forward with the others. A short distance away, the Philadelphia Kid was already on his feet, his bandaged arm held close to his body but his good hand steady on his rifle. The night had tested him in ways the daylight fighting had not. He had fired at shapes he could barely see and helped hold a section of line when everything around him felt like it was coming apart. Now, with the sun up, he could see the true cost. Bodies lay where they had fallen during the darkness. Wounded men called out in voices that were raw from the night. The Philadelphia Kid moved among them when he could, using his quick hands to help tie bandages or pass water. One Marine he had fought beside during the pier advance was gone. The Kid had not seen it happen, but he felt the absence like a missing step on a familiar staircase. When orders came to advance toward a cluster of Japanese positions inland, he did not hesitate. He had learned in the dark that hesitation could cost more than moving forward ever would. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon had spent the last hours of the night keeping watch while others tried to rest. He had always been the one who noticed details, and the night had given him too many to carry. Now, as the light returned, he saw the exhaustion in every face around him. Men moved like sleepwalkers, their steps heavy and their eyes distant. He shared what little water he had left with a man whose canteen had been punctured during the night. The simple act of passing the canteen and watching the other Marine drink felt like an anchor in the middle of the chaos. When the order came to push inland, the Oregon Marine checked his rifle and fell in with the group. He did not speak much. He simply placed one foot in front of the other and kept his eyes moving, the same way he had crossed the lagoon and fought along the pier. Each small victory, clearing a section of ground, reaching a new piece of cover, came at a cost that grew heavier with every hour. Colonel Shoup's presence still reached them through runners and the steady example he set. Even wounded, he continued to move among the positions, directing fire, coordinating the fresh troops coming across the pier, and refusing to let the beachhead dissolve into isolated groups. The men who saw him limping from one cluster of Marines to another found a stubborn kind of strength in his refusal to yield. The farm boy saw him once that morning, speaking calmly to a group of replacements who had just come in. Shoup's voice carried the same steady tone it had the day before. He told them what needed to be done and made it sound possible. That was enough for many of the exhausted men who had already survived too much. The advance inland was slow and brutal. Japanese positions that had survived the bombardment and the first day's fighting now revealed themselves in the daylight. Pillboxes and bunkers connected by tunnels forced the Marines to reduce each strongpoint one at a time. There was no quick rush across open ground. Every yard had to be earned with grenades, rifle fire, and the grim work of getting close enough to finish what the heavy weapons could not. The farm boy found himself part of a small group moving toward a bunker that had been pouring fire into their flank. They advanced by short rushes, one man moving while the others covered him. When the man in front of him was hit, the farm boy dragged him back and applied pressure to the wound while the others kept firing. The wounded Marine looked at him with eyes that were already glazing over and whispered something the farm boy could not quite hear. He stayed with him until the corpsman arrived, then picked up his rifle again and kept moving. There was no time for grief. There was only the next position and the next man who needed help. The Philadelphia Kid showed the same quick thinking he had used on the pier. When his group reached a section where the Japanese fire was coming from two directions at once, he used the wrecked equipment scattered across the ground to create a temporary screen. He directed the men around him with short, clear commands, his steady hands moving with purpose even as bullets kicked up coral dust around them. One of the replacements he was leading hesitated at the edge of open ground. The Philadelphia Kid touched his shoulder and said, "We go together." On three. They moved as one, and the hesitation broke. Later, when they had cleared the position, the Kid helped carry a wounded man back toward the beachhead. The small act of looking after someone else kept his own exhaustion from overwhelming him. The Oregon Marine continued his quiet, deliberate progress. He noticed the patterns in the Japanese defense, the way they would hold a position until it became impossible, then fall back to the next one. He shared what he saw with the men around him, helping them anticipate the next burst of fire. When one of his companions was hit in the leg, he and another Marine carried him to cover and stayed with him until help arrived. The Oregon Marine did not speak of the fear he felt or the weight of the losses he had already seen. He simply did what needed doing, one careful step at a time, the same way he had survived the long walk through the water on the first day. The physical and mental exhaustion was visible in every movement. Men who had been strong and quick the day before now moved like old men, their shoulders slumped and their eyes hollow. The heat of the day pressed down on them, and the lack of sleep made every decision feel heavier. Yet they kept advancing because stopping meant giving the enemy time to reorganize and because the only way off the island was forward. Small victories came at heartbreaking cost. A bunker cleared meant 2 or 3 men down. A section of ground gained meant carrying a wounded buddy back through fire that had already taken too many. The farm boy saw one of the men from his boat on the first day fall during a short rush and felt the loss settle deep in his chest. He had not known the man's name, but they had shared a moment of quiet conversation on the transport. That was enough to make the death feel personal. The Japanese resistance remained fierce and coordinated. They fought from positions that were difficult to see until the Marines were almost on top of them. They used the tunnels to move between strongpoints and to appear where they were least expected. The Marines learned quickly that every position had to be reduced completely or the enemy would reappear behind them. This was attrition warfare at its most brutal, slow, costly, and demanding everything from the men who carried it out. Yet with each small gain, the beachhead grew stronger. Fresh troops and supplies continued to come across the pier. The line inched forward, not in dramatic charges but in the stubborn, grinding advance of men who refused to stop. By midday the exhaustion had settled into something deeper. Men spoke less. They moved because movement was the only thing left to do. The Philadelphia Kid helped organize a small group of replacements who had just arrived, showing them how to advance without exposing themselves unnecessarily. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he had already seen. The Oregon Marine continued to notice the small details that others missed, the way a particular bunker was camouflaged, the direction the next burst of fire was likely to come from. He shared what he could and kept moving. The farm boy found himself helping a wounded man back toward the beachhead after a particularly costly push. As they moved, the wounded Marine asked him to write a letter to his family if he did not make it. The farm boy promised he would, even though he had no idea how he would keep that promise. The simple act of giving his word to another man gave him something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. The day wore on with the same relentless rhythm. Positions were cleared one by one. Ground was gained in painful increments. The cost continued to mount, but so did the strength of the beachhead. Colonel Shoup's steady leadership and the refusal of men like the farm boy, the Philadelphia Kid, and the Oregon Marine to break kept the advance alive. They were no longer the same young men who had stepped off the boats the day before. The night of terror and the renewed hell of the second day had changed them. Yet they kept moving because the only alternative was to let everything they had already lost be for nothing. If the stubborn courage of these men, their refusal to stop even when every step cost more than they thought they could give, has moved you, and you want to see the faces and the spirit of the Pacific Theater warriors brought to life with powerful intensity, Amazon offers a thoughtfully curated collection of World War II memorabilia and the gripping film Midway on Prime Video. These are ways to connect with the courage and the sacrifice we have been exploring, to honor the men who kept advancing through the fire and the exhaustion. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the afternoon light began to soften, the Marines who had survived the second day found brief moments of rest in whatever cover they could find. They shared what little water and food remained. They checked on one another with quiet words and steady hands. The farm boy from Iowa sat with his back against a bunker wall that had finally been cleared and thought about the promise he had made to the wounded man. He did not know if he would be able to keep it, but the act of making the promise had given him something to carry forward. The Philadelphia kid cleaned his rifle with the same careful attention he had once given to a deck of cards. The Oregon Marine kept his eyes on the ground ahead, already thinking about what the next push would require. They were exhausted, grieving, and far from finished, yet they had gained ground that had seemed impossible only hours earlier. The renewed hell of the second day had tested them beyond anything they had imagined, but the stubborn advance had held. The island was still far from taken, but because these men and thousands like them had refused to stop, the beachhead was growing stronger with every hard-won yard. The fight would continue, and they would continue with it, one step at a time, carrying the weight of everything they had lost and everything they still hoped to save. The airfield lay at the heart of the island like a prize that had already demanded more than anyone could have imagined, and the men who fought toward its edges understood that even claiming it would leave them standing on ground soaked in the blood of too many friends. By the afternoon of the second day, the push inland had brought the Marines close enough to see the long, scarred runway that stretched across the center of Betio. What had once been a simple strip of coral and packed earth now represented everything the battle had become, a tangible objective that could change the course of operations across the Central Pacific if it could be taken and held. The Japanese defenders knew its value as well. They had turned the edges of the airfield and the ground around it into a network of pillboxes, trenches, and firing positions that had to be reduced one by one. There would be no dramatic charge across open ground. Every yard forward came under fire from positions that seemed to appear out of the coral itself. The farm boy from Iowa moved with a group that had been ordered to clear a line of bunkers guarding the western edge of the runway. His body ached from 2 days of fighting and almost no sleep, but the sight of the airfield ahead gave him something to focus on beyond the exhaustion. He thought about the men who had already fallen, the ones from his boat, the ones he had helped in the water, the quiet conversations that would never happen again. When his group reached a point where the fire from a nearby pillbox pinned them down, he found himself lying flat against the coral while bullets snapped overhead. The man beside him was hit in the leg. Without thinking, the farm boy crawled forward, grabbed the wounded Marine under the arms, and dragged him back to a slight depression in the ground. He pressed a field dressing against the wound and told the man to stay low. Then he picked up his rifle again and waited for the next signal to move. The small act of helping someone else steadied him in a way that nothing else could. It reminded him that even in the middle of this grinding fight, he was not alone. A short distance away, the Philadelphia kid was part of another assault team working along the southern edge of the airfield. His bandaged arm still hurt, but he had learned to work around the pain. When his group came under fire from 2 directions at once, he used the scattered wreckage of a Japanese aircraft as cover and directed the men around him with short, clear instructions. His quick hands moved with steady purpose as he helped set up a light machine gun in a position that could suppress one of the enemy strongpoints. When the gunner was hit, the Philadelphia kid took over without hesitation, swinging the weapon to cover the advance of the others. He kept firing until the belt ran out, then grabbed his rifle and followed the men forward. Later, when they had gained a few more yards and found a moment of relative quiet, he helped carry a wounded man back toward the aid station that had been set up near the pier. The simple act of looking after someone else kept his own mind from dwelling too long on the friends he had already lost. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon advanced with the same quiet determination he had shown since the first day. He noticed the way the Japanese defenders were using the airfield's own structures, the control tower, the revetments, the drainage ditches, to create interlocking fields of fire. He shared what he saw with the men around him, helping them understand where the next burst of fire was likely to come from. When one of his companions was hit during a short rush across open ground, the Oregon Marine and another man carried him to cover and stayed with him until a corpsman could reach the position. The wounded Marine gripped his hand and asked him to remember his name if he did not make it. The Oregon Marine promised he would. He did not speak much after that. He simply checked his rifle, made sure the man beside him was ready, and kept moving when the signal came. Each small gain felt heavier than the last, but stopping was never an option. Colonel Shoup's steady leadership continued to reach the men fighting for the airfield. Runners moved back and forth carrying messages, and every time word came that the beachhead was still secure and that more supplies were coming across the pier, the men found a little more strength. Shoup himself had been moving among the forward positions despite his wound, directing fire and coordinating the assault teams. The farm boy saw him once that afternoon, speaking calmly to a group of men who had just taken a particularly difficult bunker. Shoup's voice carried the same steady tone it always had. He told them what they had accomplished and what still needed to be done, and he made it sound possible. That was enough to keep many of them moving when their bodies wanted to stop. The coordinated assaults on the airfield's defenses were slow, brutal, and costly. Marines worked in small teams, using grenades, satchel charges, and direct rifle fire to reduce each position. There were moments of grim triumph when a bunker fell silent and men could advance a few more yards. There were also moments when the cost felt almost unbearable. The Philadelphia Kid watched a Marine he had fought beside since the pier fall during one of the rushes. He had no time to stop and grieve. He kept moving because the only way to honor the dead was to keep taking the ground they had died for. The Oregon Marine noticed the way the Japanese fire patterns changed as the afternoon wore on, the way they seemed to be conserving ammunition in some sectors while pouring it on in others. He shared what he observed and helped the men around him adjust their movements. The farm boy found himself in the middle of a particularly fierce exchange of fire near one of the airfield's drainage ditches. He and the men with him took cover and returned fire until the Japanese position went quiet. When they moved forward to clear it, they found only 2 defenders still alive. The sight of young men who had fought so hard for so little ground stayed with him long after the position was secured. As the sun began to drop lower in the sky, the Marines had gained a foothold on parts of the airfield itself. It was not the clean victory that planners might have hoped for. The runway was scarred with craters and littered with wreckage. Japanese positions still held parts of the eastern end, and fire still swept across open sections. But the symbolic and strategic heart of Betio was now at least partially in American hands. The farm boy sat for a moment behind a wrecked revetment, breathing hard and trying to steady his hands. He thought about the man he had dragged to cover earlier and wondered if he had made it to the aid station. He thought about the friends who would never see this airfield or any other. The Philadelphia Kid helped organize the defense of the ground they had just taken, making sure the men around him knew where to watch and how to support one another. His steady hands moved with purpose even as his eyes carried the weight of everything he had seen. The Oregon Marine kept his quiet watch, noticing the way the light changed across the runway and the way the Japanese fire had slackened in some areas but not others. He shared what he saw and prepared for whatever the night or the next day might bring. The emotional cost of seizing the airfield settled heavily on the survivors. There was a grim satisfaction in having taken the prize that had seemed so important from a distance, but it was mixed with the constant presence of death. Every position cleared meant more names that would never be called again. Every yard gained meant carrying another wounded man back through fire. The men who had survived the long walk through the water, the terror of the night, and the grinding advance of the second day now stood on ground that had cost more than they could measure. Yet they also understood that holding this airfield could change what came next for the larger campaign across the Pacific. It was a prize worth the price, even if the price had been paid in the blood of men who had only wanted to go home. If the raw courage and the terrible cost of fights like this one, the desperate assaults, the small acts of heroism, and the heavy price paid for every yard, have stayed with you, And you want to see the unflinching reality of what these men endured, there is a collection that shows it without softening or censorship. The exclusive Gumroad archive contains rare, uncensored photographs and footage from Tarawa and the wider Pacific campaign, material too graphic and honest for most platforms to host. These images let you witness the true face of the battle for the airfield in a way that brings the human story closer than any words alone can manage. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As darkness began to settle over the airfield once more, the men who had fought for it settled into whatever cover they could find among the wreckage and the craters. Some wrote quick notes by the light of shielded flashlights. Others simply sat in silence, sharing what little water or food remained. The farm boy from Iowa leaned against the side of a revetment and thought about the promise he had made earlier in the day. He did not know if he would ever be able to keep it, but the act of making it had given him something to carry forward. The Philadelphia kid cleaned his rifle with steady hands, the same hands that had once dealt cards to pass the time on the transport. The Oregon Marine kept watch, noticing the patterns of the coming night and preparing for whatever it might bring. They had taken the airfield, or at least enough of it to matter. The prize had cost everything they had to give and more, but because they had kept moving, because they had refused to leave one another behind, the heart of Betio was now in their hands. The fight was far from over, yet in the gathering darkness there was a fragile sense that something important had been achieved, not just ground, but the knowledge that ordinary young men, pushed beyond every limit they had ever known, could still take the prize that had seemed impossible only days before. The airfield had been taken, but the island was still full of hidden places where death waited in the dark, and the men who had to go into those places learned that the final work of victory could be the ugliest and most intimate fighting of all. With the runway now partially in American hands, the larger battle shifted into something smaller and far more brutal. The Japanese defenders who remained had pulled back into the network of bunkers, pillboxes, and connecting tunnels that had been built to survive everything the attackers could throw at them from a distance. These were not positions that could be bypassed or ignored. They had to be cleared one by one, and the only way to do it was to get close enough to look into another man's eyes before ending his life, close enough to smell the cordite and the fear and the blood in spaces barely big enough for two people to stand. This was the dirty work of victory, and it fell to young men who had already survived the reef, the pier, the night, and the long advance across open ground. The farm boy from Iowa found himself part of a team assigned to reduce a cluster of bunkers near the eastern end of the airfield. He had grown used to the open fighting of the previous days, even the terror of the night. This was different. The entrance to the first bunker was low and narrow, half hidden by coral rubble and the remains of what had once been a palm grove. When the flamethrower team moved up, the farm boy stayed close enough to support them but far enough back that the heat and the roar of the weapon would not overwhelm him. He watched the stream of fire disappear into the darkness and felt something turn in his stomach. There were men inside that hole, men who had fought as hard as he had, men who had families somewhere just like his own. When the flamethrower stopped and the team moved forward with grenades and rifles, he followed because there was no other choice. The smell that came out of the bunker was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He did not speak of it afterward. He simply helped drag the bodies clear so the next position could be approached, and he tried not to look too closely at the faces. A short distance away, the Philadelphia kid was working with another team clearing a line of pillboxes that had been firing across the runway. His quick hands proved useful in the tight spaces. When one of the bunkers refused to yield to grenades, he helped rig a satchel charge and placed it carefully against the firing slit while the others covered him. The explosion shook the ground and sent coral fragments flying. When the dust settled, he was the first one to move forward and check the interior. What he found inside was not the clean destruction he had imagined. It was something far more personal and far more final. He stepped back out into the light and took a long breath before reporting that the position was clear. The men around him did not ask for details. They had all seen enough by now to know what those details would be. The Philadelphia Kid simply reloaded his rifle and moved to the next bunker, because the work had to be finished and because stopping would have meant letting someone else walk into the same darkness. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon had always been the one who noticed things others missed. In these close-quarters fights, that habit became both a burden and a strange kind of strength. He watched the way the Japanese defenders sometimes fought to the last man inside their positions and sometimes tried to surrender when there was no longer any hope. He saw the hesitation in some of the Marines around him when they reached that moment, the split second where training and humanity collided. He did not judge. He simply did what needed to be done and helped the men beside him do the same. When one of his companions froze at the entrance to a tunnel after a grenade had gone in, the Oregon Marine touched his shoulder and said quietly that they would go together. They entered the dark space side by side, rifles ready, and cleared it without speaking another word. Later, when they had a moment to rest, the Oregon Marine wrote a few lines in his mind, the closest he could come to the notebook he had lost in the lagoon. He described the way the air tasted inside those holes and the way the silence afterward felt heavier than any noise. He did not know if he would ever put those words on paper, but carrying them helped him keep moving. Colonel Shoup's steady presence still reached the men doing this work. Runners moved carefully between the teams, carrying messages and what little news there was of progress elsewhere on the island. Word came that the beachhead was secure, that more supplies were coming in, and that the airfield was now firmly in American hands. Shoup himself continued to move among the forward positions despite his wound, offering calm words and clear direction. The farm boy saw him once during the afternoon, speaking to a group of men who had just cleared a particularly difficult bunker complex. Shoup's voice carried the same steady tone it had always carried. He told them what they had accomplished and what still needed to be done, and he made the next terrible task sound possible. That was enough for many of the exhausted men who were reaching the limits of what they thought they could endure. The psychological impact of this close-quarters clearing settled heavily on everyone who took part in it. There was no glory in kicking open a bunker door and ending the lives of men who had nowhere left to run. There was only the grim necessity of finishing the job so that no one else would have to die because a position had been left uncleared. Some Marines found ways to distance themselves from what they were doing, focusing on the mechanics of the grenade or the flamethrower, thinking only about the next step and the man beside them. Others carried the weight of every face they saw and every life they ended. The farm boy found himself thinking about the letter still in his pocket, the one he had written before the landing. He wondered what he would add to it now if he had the chance, and whether the person who might one day read it could ever understand what these days had required of him. He did not have answers. He only had the next bunker and the next team of men who needed him to keep moving. There were small moments of humanity even in the middle of this work. The Philadelphia Kid helped a wounded Marine from another team back toward the aid station after a bunker had been cleared, using his steady hands to support the man's weight across the broken ground. The Oregon Marine shared what little water he had left with a man who had run dry during a long stretch of clearing operations. The farm boy stayed with a wounded comrade inside a captured position until a corpsman could reach them, speaking quietly about nothing in particular because the sound of a familiar voice seemed to help more than silence. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet ways men reminded one another that even in the worst work imaginable, they were still human and still responsible for one another. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to change, more and more of the island's hidden places fell silent. The network of bunkers and tunnels that had seemed so formidable from a distance was being reduced position by position, hole by hole. It was slow, dangerous, and exhausting work, but it was the only way the island could be made secure. The men who carried it out did so with a grim professionalism that had little to do with hatred and everything to do with finishing what they had started. They had crossed the reef, held the beachhead through the night, taken the airfield, and now they were finishing the job in the places where the enemy had chosen to make their last stand. There was no celebration when a position was cleared. There was only the next one waiting and the knowledge that every bunker taken brought them one step closer to the end of this terrible chapter. If the grim courage and the quiet humanity of these men, the ones who had to do the dirtiest and most personal work of the battle, have stayed with you, and you want to help ensure that their stories and their sacrifices are preserved with care and honesty, even the smallest contribution makes a real difference. Supporting this work with a small tip on Ko-Fi, starting at just $1, helps keep the research and the storytelling alive so that the full truth of what these ordinary young men endured is never forgotten. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As evening settled over the atoll, the teams that had spent the day clearing the rat holes found brief moments of rest wherever they could. Some sat in the shade of captured bunkers and shared what little food remained. Others simply lay back and closed their eyes, trying to shut out the images that would stay with them long after the island was secured. The farm boy from Iowa leaned against the coral wall of a position that had finally gone silent and thought about the faces he had seen that day. He did not try to push the memories away. He simply carried them, the way he had carried everything else since the first boat grounded on the reef. The Philadelphia kid cleaned his rifle with steady hands, the same hands that had placed charges and helped wounded men and fired into darkness. The Oregon Marine kept his quiet watch, noticing the way the light changed and preparing for whatever the night might still bring. The dirty work of victory was far from finished, but it was being done, one bunker, one tunnel, one grim and necessary step at a time. The men who carried it out had already given more than they had ever imagined they would be asked to give. They would give whatever was still required because the only way home was through the last of these hidden places, and because they had learned that even in the worst work imaginable, they could still look after one another and still refuse to let the darkness win. The rising sun made its final stand not in the grand charge of legend but in the desperate, exhausted fury of men who had nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose except the manner of their dying. By the third day the island had been reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. The airfield was in American hands. Most of the bunkers and tunnels had been cleared through the grim, necessary work of flamethrowers and grenades. Yet in the remaining strongholds, connected by tunnels and hidden among the wreckage of what had once been a peaceful atoll, small groups of Japanese soldiers and sailors still fought. They had been ordered to hold until the end, and most of them intended to obey. There would be no surrender. There would only be the final, furious attempts to strike back before the last positions fell. In one of the last intact bunker complexes near the eastern shore, a young Japanese soldier sat with his back against the coral wall and wrote a final letter by the dim light of a shielded lantern. He had been on the island for months, helping to build the defenses that had already cost the attackers so dearly. He had watched friends die during the bombardment and the first landings. He had survived the night attacks and the long hours of close-quarters fighting. Now, with the tunnels collapsing around them and the sound of American voices growing closer, he wrote to his family about the beauty of the lagoon at sunrise and the way the sea had looked on the morning he arrived. He did not write about fear or about the certainty that he would not see them again. He wrote instead about duty and about the promise he had made to his comrades that they would face whatever came together. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his uniform, knowing it would almost certainly never be read. Then he checked his rifle and waited with the others for the order that would send them out one last time. Nearby, an older officer moved among his remaining men with the same quiet steadiness he had shown since the first shells fell. He had known for days that the battle was lost. The American forces had taken the airfield, cleared most of the defensive network, and continued to bring in fresh troops and supplies across the captured pier. Yet he also knew his duty. He spoke to each man in turn, reminding them of what they had already endured and of the honor that remained even in defeat. He did not promise victory. He promised only that they would not die without striking back. When the time came, he led them out of the bunker in a final, coordinated rush toward the nearest American positions. There was no grand shouting or waving of flags. There was only the grim determination of men who had decided that the only honorable end was to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. The Marines who faced these final stands had already been through too much to feel anything as simple as triumph. The farm boy from Iowa was part of a line that had been pushing steadily eastward when the first wave of the last organized counterattack came. He had spent the morning helping clear another bunker complex and was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. When the Japanese soldiers emerged from the remaining positions and charged across the broken ground, he felt a strange mixture of horror and pity. These were not the disciplined troops he had imagined in training. They were men who looked as worn and desperate as he felt, some wounded, some barely able to run, all of them moving forward because there was no other choice left. He fired steadily, aiming carefully, trying not to think about the faces he could see in the morning light. When one of the charging men fell only a few yards from his position, the farm boy saw that he was barely more than a boy himself. For a moment the two of them locked eyes. Then the firing stopped and the charge broke against the Marine line. The farm boy lowered his rifle and took a long, shaking breath. He had done what he had to do. He had also seen the human cost of the final stand in a way he would never forget. A short distance away, the Philadelphia Kid was helping to organize the defense when the attack reached his sector. His steady hands moved quickly as he helped redistribute ammunition and directed the men around him to the best cover. When the Japanese soldiers came close enough that he could see their faces, he felt the same cold weight he had carried since the first day. He fired until his rifle was empty, reloaded, and fired again. There was no hatred in it anymore, only the grim necessity of ending something that should never have begun. When the charge finally broke and the last of the attackers fell or retreated, he helped drag a wounded Marine to cover and applied a field dressing with the same careful attention he had once given to a deck of cards on the transport deck. The small act of caring for someone else steadied him. It reminded him that even in the middle of this final, furious violence, he was still capable of something other than killing. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon had spent the morning observing the way the remaining Japanese positions were connected and how the last defenders were likely to use the tunnels to stage their final attacks. When the banzai charge came, he was ready. He fired with the same deliberate calm he had shown since the long walk through the lagoon, aiming carefully and conserving ammunition. When one of his companions was hit during the chaos, he pulled the man back and stayed with him until help arrived. Later, as the firing died down and the last of the organized resistance in that sector collapsed, he sat for a moment and looked out across the ground they had just defended. He thought about the men who had charged them and about the waste of it all, the lives thrown away in a cause that was already lost. He did not speak his thoughts aloud. He simply checked his rifle, made sure the men around him were ready for whatever might come next, and prepared to keep moving when the order arrived. Colonel Shoup's steady leadership continued to shape the final hours. Even as the organized resistance crumbled, he moved among the forward positions, directing the mopping up operations and making sure that no position was left uncleared. The men who saw him limping from one cluster of Marines to another found strength in his refusal to let the job go unfinished. The farm boy heard one of the messages Shoup sent forward, that the airfield was secure, that the beachhead was holding, and that every remaining pocket had to be dealt with before night fell again. The words gave the exhausted men something to hold on to. They were not fighting for glory anymore. They were fighting to finish what they had started so that no one else would have to die because a single bunker or tunnel had been ignored. The final stands were marked by a terrible mixture of courage and futility. Some Japanese soldiers fought with almost superhuman determination, charging machine gun positions or throwing themselves at Marine lines with nothing but rifles and bayonets. Others simply waited in their last positions until the flamethrowers or grenades reached them. In both cases the outcome was the same. The organized resistance ended not in a single dramatic moment but in a series of small, brutal encounters that left the ground littered with the dead from both sides. The Marines who survived these final clashes felt no triumph. They felt only a deep, weary relief that the worst of the fighting was finally over and a quiet sorrow for the lives that had been thrown away in the last hours. As the sun began to set on the third day, the last pockets of resistance fell silent. The rising sun had set in blood, not in the glory its defenders had been promised, but in the tragic reality of men who had been ordered to die and who had obeyed to the end. The Marines who had faced them now moved through the wreckage of the island, checking the last positions and caring for their own wounded. The farm boy from Iowa sat with his back against a bunker wall and thought about the young soldier he had seen fall during the final charge. He wondered what that man's family would never know and whether any of them would ever learn how bravely he had fought in a lost cause. The Philadelphia kid helped carry a wounded comrade toward the aid station, his steady hands supporting the man's weight across the broken ground. The Oregon Marine kept his quiet watch, noticing the way the light changed over the lagoon and preparing for the night that would finally bring something closer to peace. The island was not yet completely secure. Scattered individuals and small groups would continue to fight or hide for days to come. But the organized, coordinated defense had ended. The final, furious stand was over. What remained was the long, grim work of making sure no threat remained and of beginning to understand what the battle had cost everyone who had taken part in it. If the raw courage on both sides and the terrible human cost of this final stand have stayed with you, and you want to go deeper into the unfiltered stories of World War II, the conversations that happened in the last hours, the quiet acts of humanity amid the violence, and the full truth behind the official accounts, there is a place where that deeper connection is possible. The Patreon community for history lovers offers uncensored extended podcasts, raw video segments, and a welcoming circle of fellow enthusiasts who believe these individual lives deserve to be remembered completely and without simplification. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As darkness settled over the atoll for the final time, the men who had survived the last stands found what rest they could among the wreckage. Some wrote letters by the light of shielded lanterns, trying to capture what they had seen before memory softened the edges. Others simply sat together in small groups, sharing what little water or food remained and speaking in low voices about home. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia kid, and the thoughtful Marine from Oregon were still there, exhausted, changed forever by what they had endured, but still standing. The rising sun had set in blood, but the men who had faced its final fury had refused to break. They had met the last desperate charges with grim resolve and quiet courage, and they had finished the job they had been sent to do. The island was theirs now, bought at a price no one could have imagined when the first boats grounded on the reef. In the gathering darkness there was no celebration, only the quiet understanding that the worst was over and that the long work of healing, both for the living and for the memory of the dead, had only just begun. When the last shots faded and the island finally fell silent, the men who had fought for it stepped out into a landscape that no longer resembled anything they had imagined when they first saw its shape on a map. The morning light revealed what 3 days of fighting had done to the narrow strip of coral and sand. Bodies lay where they had fallen, American Marines in the shallows and on the beach, Japanese soldiers in the wreckage of bunkers and along the edges of the airfield. The sand was stained dark in places, and the air carried a heavy, metallic smell that mixed with the salt of the lagoon. Wrecked landing craft sat half submerged on the reef. The long pier that had been fought for so desperately was scarred with bullet marks and splintered wood. Palm trees that had once swayed in the breeze were now broken stumps or burned skeletons. The airfield runway, once the prize that had seemed worth any cost, was cratered and littered with the remains of aircraft and equipment. This was the island of the dead, and the men who had survived walked through it in a silence that felt deeper than any exhaustion they had known. The farm boy from Iowa moved slowly along the edge of the beach where he had first come ashore. His uniform was stiff with salt and dust, and the wound on his arm had been bandaged again during the night, but he barely felt it. He was looking for faces he recognized, men from his boat, men he had shared quiet moments with during the long voyage, men he had fought beside in the water and on the pier. He found one near the low sea wall, half covered by sand that had been kicked up during the final hours. He knelt beside the body for a long moment, not praying exactly, but simply being present. Then he gently pulled the dog tags free and placed them in his pocket with the others he had already collected. He did not know what would happen to them or who would eventually read the names, but he could not leave them behind. When he stood again, he saw another Marine a short distance away doing the same thing, moving from body to body with quiet care, as if the simple act of acknowledging the dead was the only thing left that made sense. A little farther inland, near the section of the airfield they had fought so hard to reach, the Philadelphia Kid stood with a small group of men who had survived the final stands. His hands, which had been so steady through the fighting, now hung at his sides as he looked out across the runway. He had helped carry wounded men to safety during the night and had fired until his rifle was too hot to touch. Now there was nothing left to do but stand in the silence and try to understand what had just happened. One of the men beside him spoke in a low voice about a buddy who had been hit during the last charge. The Philadelphia Kid listened without interrupting. When the man finished, he simply nodded and offered his canteen. There were no grand words, no speeches about victory or sacrifice. There was only the shared understanding that they had all seen too much and that the only thing keeping them upright was the presence of the men still standing beside them. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon walked a little apart from the others, his eyes moving across the destruction with the same careful attention he had always given to details. He noticed the way the Japanese defenders had tried to camouflage their last positions, the way some of the bunkers had been reinforced right up until the end, and the way the American dead had fallen in patterns that told the story of the final advances. He did not speak much. He simply observed and carried what he saw. Later he would try to put some of it into words, but for now he let the silence hold what language could not yet touch. When he came across a Marine who had been killed while trying to help a wounded comrade, he stopped and carefully arranged the body so it would be easier for the burial teams to find. It was a small act, almost meaningless in the scale of what had happened, but it was something he could do. It was something that felt human in a place that had stopped feeling human days ago. Colonel Shoup moved among the survivors with the same steady presence he had shown since the first boats grounded. His wound had been treated, but he still limped as he walked the length of the beachhead and the edge of the airfield. He stopped to speak with small groups of men, asking after their condition and making sure they knew what came next. There were no dramatic declarations. He simply told them that the island was secure, that the worst was over, and that they had done what had been asked of them. The farm boy saw him once that morning and felt something loosen in his chest. Shoup had been the steady point through every hour of chaos. Seeing him still standing, still moving among them, made the silence feel a little less empty. As the morning wore on, the scale of what had been lost began to settle over everyone who walked the island. Bodies were being gathered and identified where possible. Wounded men were being carried to the aid stations that had been set up near the pier. The living moved among the dead with a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, fragile relief. Some men wrote letters while they could still remember the details of what they had seen. Others simply sat together in small groups, sharing what little water or food remained and speaking in low voices about the men who were no longer there. The Philadelphia Kid helped organize a group of replacements who had come in during the final hours and had missed the worst of the fighting. He showed them where to find cover and how to move across the broken ground, his steady hands demonstrating what words could not fully explain. The Oregon Marine continued his quiet observation, noticing the way the sea was already beginning to wash some of the debris from the reef and the way the light changed across the lagoon as if nothing had happened here at all. The emotional weight of the silence was heavier than any of them had expected. There was relief that the guns had finally stopped, but it was mixed with a grief that had no single name. They had lost friends whose faces they would never forget. They had seen men die in ways that would stay with them long after they left the island. They had also seen ordinary young men perform acts of courage and kindness that no one back home would ever fully understand. The farm boy thought about the letter still in his pocket, the one he had written before the landing, and wondered what he would add to it now if he had the chance. He had survived. He had helped others survive. He had also been changed in ways he could not yet put into words. When another Marine offered him a cigarette, he took it and smoked it slowly, letting the familiar ritual anchor him in the present moment. There were small moments of humanity even in the middle of this landscape of loss. Men who had fought beside one another for 3 days now shared what little they had left. A corpsman who had worked without rest through the night stopped to help a Marine who was trying to identify a fallen friend. The Philadelphia Kid used his steady hands to help rig a makeshift stretcher for a wounded man who could not walk. The Oregon Marine shared a story about home with a group of replacements who had never seen combat before, giving them something ordinary to hold on to while the extraordinary settled around them. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet ways men reminded one another that even after everything they had endured, they were still capable of caring for the living and honoring the dead. As the day moved forward, the first fragile sense of what they had achieved began to take shape. The island was secure. The airfield was in American hands. The beachhead that had seemed impossible to hold on the first day had grown into something that could support further operations. The cost had been terrible, far higher than anyone had imagined when the plans were made. But the men who had paid that cost had also accomplished something that would matter in the larger campaign across the Pacific. They had proven that an atoll could be taken, even when the defenses were strong and the planning had flaws. They had also learned lessons that would save lives in the battles still to come. If the stunned silence and the quiet courage of these men, the ones who walked through the island of the dead and found ways to keep caring for one another, have stayed with you, and you want to explore the deeper, often hidden stories of World War II, the secret operations, the forgotten turning points, and the individual acts of resilience that shaped the outcome of entire campaigns, there is a way to go much further. Signing up for the free email newsletter will bring you the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with regular deep dive episodes that uncover the espionage, the hidden heroes, and the moments that changed history in ways most people never hear about. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the sun climbed higher over the atoll, the men who had survived began to move with more purpose. Burial parties were organized. Wounded men were evacuated to ships waiting offshore. Small groups of Marines started to clear the last scattered resistance that still lingered in isolated pockets. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia Kid, and the thoughtful Marine from Oregon were still there, changed forever by what they had seen and done, but still standing. The island of the dead was no longer only a place of loss. It was also a place where ordinary young men had refused to break, where they had cared for one another in the middle of unimaginable destruction, and where they had begun, in the first fragile hours of silence, to understand what they had endured and what it had cost. The guns were quiet now. The sea moved gently against the reef. And the men who had fought for this narrow strip of coral walked through the aftermath carrying both the weight of everything they had lost and the quiet knowledge that they had done what had been asked of them, no matter how impossible it had once seemed. The names on the lists and the telegrams were never just names. They were young men who had once laughed with their friends on a transport deck, written letters to sweethearts by the light of a shielded lantern, and carried quiet hopes of coming home to ordinary lives that would never again be ordinary for the people who loved them. When the fighting finally ended and the last pockets of resistance were cleared, the men who had survived began the long, painful work of understanding what they had lost. The island was secure, The airfield was in their hands, and the beachhead that had seemed impossible to hold now supported the weight of victory. But victory had a face, and it belonged to the friends who would never see another sunrise, never write another letter, and never walk through a front door to the people waiting for them. The farm boy from Iowa moved through the days after the battle with a quiet determination that masked the weight he carried. He had collected dog tags from men he had known and from men he had only fought beside for a few hours. Each tag was a name, and each name was a story that would now have to be told by someone else. He thought often of the letter still in his pocket, the one he had written before the first boats grounded, and wondered what he would add to it if he ever found the words. He had survived the reef, the pier, the night attacks, and the final stands, but he had also watched men die in ways that would stay with him long after the salt air of the Pacific was replaced by the familiar smells of home. When he helped carry a wounded comrade to the evacuation point, he did so with steady hands, but his eyes held a distance that had not been there when he first stepped off the transport. The Philadelphia kid sat for a long time one evening with a small group of men who had fought together since the first day. His bandaged arm still ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the emptiness he felt when he realized how many familiar faces were missing. He had used his quick hands to save lives during the fighting, dragging men from the water, helping rig charges, firing when others could not. And those same hands now felt strangely empty when there was no longer an immediate task to perform. He thought about the men who had fallen during the final charges and about the ones who had simply not been there when the sun rose on the last morning. One of them had been a quiet man from a small town who had shared stories about his younger sister during the long voyage. The Philadelphia kid had never learned the man's full story, but he had carried his body to a collection point with the same care he would have shown a brother. Later, when he wrote a letter home, he found himself describing not the battles but the small moments, the way the sea had looked at dawn on the morning they arrived, the sound of laughter on the transport deck, the way men had looked after one another when there was nothing left to give. He did not know if the words would make sense to anyone who had not been there, but writing them helped him begin to carry the weight of what he had seen. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon walked the scarred ground of the airfield one last time before the evacuation began. He had always noticed details, the way the light changed on the water, the patterns in the Japanese defenses, the small acts of courage that happened when no one was watching. Now he noticed the way the living moved among the dead with a mixture of exhaustion and reverence. He helped identify bodies where he could and made sure personal items were collected when possible. One afternoon he found a letter that had never been mailed, still folded inside a Marine's pocket. He read enough to know it was addressed to a mother in a small town he would never visit, then carefully placed it with the other belongings that would eventually find their way home. He did not speak much about what he had seen, but in the quiet moments between tasks he thought about how many stories had ended on this narrow strip of coral and how many more would continue in the lives of the men who had survived. The scars he carried were not only on his body. They were in the way he now understood silence and in the way he would always notice when someone was missing from a room. Colonel Shoup moved among the survivors with the same steady presence he had shown from the first moments on the beach. His wound had been treated, but he still carried himself with the quiet authority that had held the beachhead together when everything else had threatened to collapse. He spoke with men who had fought under his direction, asking after their condition and making sure they knew that what they had done mattered. He did not offer false comfort or grand speeches. He simply acknowledged the cost and the courage it had taken to pay it. The farm boy saw him once in those final days and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Shoup had been the steady point in the chaos, the man who had refused to leave the beach when leaving might have seemed the only reasonable choice. Now, as the living prepared to leave the island of the dead, Shoup's presence reminded them that leadership in war was measured not only in ground taken but in lives protected and in the example of refusing to break. The true cost of Tarawa was never captured in the numbers that would later appear in reports. It lived in the telegrams that arrived at front doors across America in the weeks and months after the battle. A mother in a small Midwestern town opened her door one afternoon to find a uniformed officer standing on her porch. She knew before he spoke what he had come to say. Her son, the quiet boy who had helped with the harvest and written letters about the stars he could see from the deck of his ship, would not be coming home. The letter he had carried in his pocket, the one he had written before the landing, arrived weeks later. She read it sitting at the kitchen table where he had once eaten breakfast, and she traced the words with her finger as if the paper could bring him back. In another town, a young wife received word that her husband had been killed during the final stands. She had been waiting for news, holding on to the hope that his last letter, the one promising he would be careful and that he loved her, would be followed by another. Instead, she received only the official notification and a small bundle of his belongings that included a photograph of the two of them taken before he left. She kept the photograph on her dresser for the rest of her life, and sometimes at night she would speak to it as if he could still hear her. The men who came home carried their own versions of these losses. Some had visible wounds that would heal over time but leave scars that told the story of where they had been. Others carried wounds that could not be seen, the memories of friends who had fallen beside them, the guilt of having survived when others had not, the difficulty of returning to a world that could never fully understand what they had endured. The farm boy returned to his family's land and tried to pick up the rhythms of ordinary work, but he found himself waking in the night to the sound of waves that were no longer there. He wrote letters to the families of the men whose dog tags he had carried, trying to find words that would honor their sons without adding to their grief. He did not always succeed, but the act of trying helped him begin to carry the names home in a way that felt meaningful. The Philadelphia kid returned to his city neighborhood and found that the streets he had once known so well now felt strangely unfamiliar. He used his steady hands to find work and to help his family, but he carried the memory of the men he had fought beside in the way he looked after the people around him. He never spoke much about the battle, but when someone asked about the scar on his arm, he would simply say that he had been lucky and change the subject. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon returned to his home in the Pacific Northwest and resumed the quiet life he had left behind, but he kept a small box of mementos, a few letters, a photograph, the names of men he had known, and sometimes in the evenings he would sit with the box and remember the ones who had not come back. The lifelong scars were not only personal. They rippled outward into families and communities that would never be the same. A father who had once been proud of his son's decision to serve now carried a quiet anger at a war that had taken so much. A sister who had looked up to her brother found herself protecting her own children from stories she could not yet bear to tell. A community that had sent its young men off with parades and promises now gathered in churches and living rooms to mourn and to try to make sense of a victory that had come at such a terrible price. The men who had survived learned to live with the knowledge that they carried not only their own lives but the names and stories of those who had not. Some found ways to speak about what they had seen. Others kept their silence, carrying the weight in private ways that only those who had been there could fully understand. If the deeply personal cost of Tarawa, the lives ended too soon, the families forever changed, and the quiet courage of those who carried the names home, has stayed with you, and you want to see the faces and the spirit of the Pacific Theater warriors brought to life with powerful intensity, Amazon offers a thoughtfully curated collection of World War II memorabilia and the gripping film Midway on Prime Video. These are ways to connect with the courage and the sacrifice we have been exploring, to honor the men whose stories ended on a distant shore and the ones who carried those stories forward. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the years passed, the men who had fought at Tarawa continued to carry the names they had brought home. They lived ordinary lives in many ways, raising families, working jobs, watching their children grow. But they carried the memory of the island and the men who had not returned in the quiet spaces between the ordinary moments. Some became active in veterans groups, helping to ensure that the stories were preserved and that the cost was never forgotten. Others simply lived with the knowledge that they had been asked to do something extraordinary and had done it, even when the price had been higher than anyone could have imagined. The true cost of Tarawa was never measured in territory gained or in the number of days the battle lasted. It was measured in the names that would never again be spoken in the kitchens and living rooms of the homes they had left behind, and in the quiet strength of the men who carried those names forward into lives that would always be shaped by what they had endured. The island of the dead had given up its last secrets, but the living would carry its story for as long as they had breath to speak it. The men who walked away from Tarawa carried more than scars and memories. They carried hard lessons written in the blood of friends, lessons that would reshape how an entire war was fought in the months and years that followed. In the quiet days after the island was secured, the survivors began to speak in low voices about what had gone wrong and what had gone right. They had crossed a reef that should have been covered by water. They had faced defenses that had survived a bombardment many believed would be decisive. They had held a narrow beachhead through a night of infiltration and counterattack because one wounded colonel refused to yield. These were not abstract problems to be studied in reports. They were the difference between life and death for the men who had lived them. Colonel Shoup, still moving among the survivors despite his own wound, listened more than he spoke in those first days. He had seen the cost up close, the men who had waded through fire because the landing craft could not reach the beach, the positions that had to be reduced one by one with flamethrowers and grenades because the naval guns had not reached them. When he was eventually evaluated, he carried those images with him, and in the months that followed he would speak of them to anyone who would listen. The lessons were not theories. They were the names of men who had died because something had been overlooked or underestimated. The farm boy from Iowa returned home changed in ways his family could see and in ways they could not. He had survived the long walk through the water, the fight for the pier, the terror of the night, and the final stands. He had helped carry wounded men and had collected the dog tags of friends who would never come home. When he was asked about the battle in later years, he rarely spoke of the moments of courage or the ground that had been taken. He spoke instead of the small things that had made survival possible, the way men had shared water when there was almost none left, the way a steady voice in the dark had kept panic from spreading, the way one officer had refused to leave the beach even when everything told him to fall back. Those were the lessons he carried. When he later read about larger operations in the Marianas and beyond, he understood why the planning had changed. The reef at Tarawa had taught someone, somewhere, that tides and hydrography could not be guessed at. The bunkers that had survived the bombardment had taught someone that concrete and coral could absorb more punishment than anyone had imagined. The night attacks had taught someone that the enemy would not simply wait for daylight to strike back. These were not distant military concepts to the farm boy. They were the difference between the friends who had come home and the ones who had not. The Philadelphia kid returned to his city neighborhood with the same steady hands that had helped him survive the pier and the final charges. He had dragged men from the water, taken over a machine gun when its gunner fell, and helped clear positions that it seemed impossible to take. In the years after the war, when he spoke of Tarawa Atoll, he talked about the way men had looked after one another when there was no one else to do it. He had seen officers who led from the front and privates who had taken command when everyone above them was gone. Those examples stayed with him. When he later heard about the massive naval bombardments that preceded landings at Saipan and Iwo Jima, he understood why the guns fired for so long and so heavily. He had been on the receiving end of what happened when they did not. When he read about improved landing craft and better coordination between ships and the men going ashore, he thought of the hours he had spent in chest-deep water under fire because the boats could not reach the beach. The lessons paid in blood at Tarawa had become changes that saved lives in the battles that followed. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon had always been the one who noticed details others missed. On the island he had observed the patterns in the Japanese defenses, the way the tide had exposed the reef, and the way small groups working together had survived when isolated men had not. After the battle he carried those observations with him into every conversation about what had happened and what should happen next. He spoke quietly but with a clarity that came from having lived the consequences of every decision. When planners in later campaigns asked for better intelligence on beaches and tides, he understood why. When they demanded more powerful and prolonged naval gunfire support, he knew the reason. When they emphasized training for night fighting and close-quarters combat, he recognized the need. The lessons were not abstract to him. They were the difference between the men who had made it off the island and the ones who had remained behind in the sand. Across the Pacific, in planning rooms and aboard ships preparing for the next great leaps, the men who had survived Tarawa began to shape what came next. Some of them served as advisors or instructors, passing on what they had learned in the most direct way possible, by telling the stories of friends who had died because something had been overlooked. They spoke of the need for better reconnaissance before any landing, for accurate information on tides and reefs and the strength of enemy positions. They spoke of the importance of overwhelming naval gunfire that did not stop until the last possible moment. They spoke of the value of rapid reinforcement once a beachhead was established, of the need for better equipment to deal with fortified positions, and of the critical role of small unit leadership when plans inevitably broke down under fire. These were not suggestions offered in ComStaff meetings. They were hard-won truths paid for by men who would never have the chance to offer them themselves. The changes came quickly because the cost at Tarawa had been too high to ignore. Future operations placed far greater emphasis on pre-invasion intelligence. Hydrographic teams studied beaches and tides with new urgency. Naval gunfire support became heavier and more sustained, with ships remaining on station longer and firing more accurately on targets identified in advance. Air support was better coordinated with the needs of the troops on the ground. Landing craft were improved, and doctrine was adjusted to account for the possibility that the first waves might have to wade or fight their way across unexpected obstacles. Training for night fighting and close-quarters combat received new attention. Most importantly, the men who had survived Tarawa carried the memory of what had gone wrong into every subsequent battle. They knew what it felt like to be pinned on a narrow beach with nowhere to go. They knew what it felt like to watch friends fall because a position had not been properly suppressed. They knew what it felt like to fight through the night against an enemy who would not yield. Those memories shaped decisions in ways no report or study ever could. In the battles that followed, at Saipan and Guam and Tinian, at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the lessons paid in blood at Tarawa began to save lives. The bombardments were longer and more intense. The intelligence was better. The coordination between ships, planes, and the men on the beaches was tighter. When problems arose, the men who had been at Tarawa recognized them faster and responded with the hard-won knowledge of what had worked and what had not. The farm boy from Iowa, had he been there, would have seen the difference. The Philadelphia kid would have recognized the value of the changes. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon would have noted the details and understood why they mattered. None of them fought in those later battles in the same way, but the lessons they had helped pay for traveled with every Marine who stepped onto a beach after Tarawa. The emotional weight of those lessons was carried by the survivors for the rest of their lives. They had lost friends so that others might live. They had endured 3 days of hell so that the next operation might be 1 day shorter or 1 beach less deadly. When they spoke of Tarawa in later years, they rarely spoke of victory or of ground taken. They spoke of the men who had not come home and of the changes that had been made because of them. There was pride in what had been accomplished, but it was always mixed with sorrow for the price that had been paid. The hard lessons had reshaped the war, but they had also reshaped the men who carried them. Some found ways to speak about what they had learned. Others kept their silence, carrying the weight in private. All of them understood that the cost at Tarawa had not been paid in vain, because the changes that followed had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost on other distant shores. If the raw courage and the terrible human cost of Tarawa, the lessons paid in blood that reshaped an entire war, have stayed with you, and you want to see the unflinching reality of what these men endured and the changes that followed, there is a collection that shows it without softening or censorship. The exclusive Gumroad archive contains rare, uncensored photographs and footage from Tarawa and the wider Pacific campaign, material too graphic and honest for most platforms to host. These images let you witness the true face of the battle and the hard education it provided in a way that brings the story closer than any description alone can manage. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the war moved forward and the lessons from Tarawa were applied in battle after battle, the men who had survived began to see the difference their sacrifice had made. The beaches they had crossed under fire became the standard against which later operations were measured. The mistakes that had cost so many lives were studied and corrected. The courage that had held a narrow beachhead through the darkest hours became the example that inspired those who followed. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia Kid, and the thoughtful Marine from Oregon carried their own versions of those lessons into whatever lives they built after the war. They had paid a price that could never be repaid, but they had also helped ensure that the price paid by those who came after them would be smaller. The hard lessons written in blood at Tarawa had reshaped the war, and in doing so they had honored the names of the men who had given everything so that others might have a better chance of coming home. The island was far behind them now, but the lessons it had taught traveled with every step they took and every decision they made in the battles still to come. What they bought with their lives was never measured in square miles of coral or in the number of days the battle lasted. It was measured in the chance for thousands of other young men to step onto other beaches with a better chance of coming home, in the example of ordinary courage that steadied a nation still learning what total war demanded, and in the quiet, lifelong reminder that freedom's true price is always paid by people whose names we are still learning to speak. In the years after the guns fell silent on that narrow atoll, the men who had survived began to understand the larger shape of what they had endured. Tarawa had been the first real test of the Central Pacific strategy, the bold decision to strike straight across the ocean rather than inch along the edges. The cost had been higher than anyone had imagined. The reef that should have been covered by water, the defenses that had survived the bombardment, the night of infiltration, and the final furious stands. These had all combined to create 3 days of fighting that shocked the nation and forced rapid changes in how the war would be fought from that point forward. Yet because those changes were made, because the lessons paid in blood were carried forward by men who had lived them, the islands that came after, Saipan and Guam and Tinian, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were assaulted with greater preparation, heavier support, and a clearer understanding of what the enemy was capable of. The airfield that had been fought for so desperately became a stepping stone, a place from which planes could reach farther into Japanese-held territory and from which the next great leaps could be launched. What had been bought with lives on that tiny speck of coral was momentum, knowledge, and the growing certainty that the long road across the Pacific could be traveled, even when every step exacted a terrible price. The farm boy from Iowa returned to the rolling fields he had left behind and tried to pick up the rhythms of ordinary work. He had carried dog tags and helped bury friends whose faces he would never forget. He had written letters to families who would never again hear their sons' voices. In the quiet evenings after the war, he sometimes sat on the porch and looked out across the land he had once taken for granted, and he thought about the young men who had died so that fields like these could remain free. He did not speak often of the battle, but when his own children asked about the scar on his arm or the distant look that sometimes crossed his face, he would tell them simply that he had been asked to do something difficult and that he had done it because others were depending on him. The names he carried home stayed with him. He made sure they were remembered at the small memorial in town and in the stories he told when the time felt right. What he had bought with his own survival was the chance to live a life that honored the ones who had not come back. The Philadelphia Kid returned to his city neighborhood with the same steady hands that had helped him survive the pier and the final charges. He used those hands to build a life, working, raising a family, looking after the people around him the way he had once looked after the men who fought beside him. He rarely spoke of Tarawa in detail, but the lessons of those days shaped the way he moved through the world. He understood what it meant to keep going when everything told you to stop. He understood what it meant to care for the person next to you when there was no one else to do it. When he read about the larger battles that followed Tarawa, he recognized the changes that had been made because of what he and thousands like him had endured. The heavier bombardments, the better coordination, the improved equipment, these had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost on other distant shores. What he had bought with his courage was not glory or recognition, but the quiet knowledge that the price he and his friends had paid had helped make the road ahead a little less deadly for those who followed. The thoughtful Marine from Oregon returned to the quiet life he had left behind, but he carried the island with him in the way he noticed the small details others overlooked. He had observed the patterns of defense and the cost of every decision during those 3 terrible days. In the years after, he found ways to speak about what he had seen, not in grand speeches, but in conversations with other veterans and in the careful way he taught his children to value the ordinary freedoms they enjoyed. He understood that Tarawa had been more than a battle. It had been a test of whether ordinary young men from every corner of a vast country could be asked to do the impossible and still find within themselves the strength to keep moving forward. The answer had been yes, but only because they had looked after one another, because they had refused to leave anyone behind, and because they had carried the names of the fallen with them long after the guns fell silent. What he had bought with his quiet resilience was the chance to live in a world where that kind of courage was remembered and honored rather than forgotten. Families across the country lived with their own versions of these costs. A mother in a small town kept her son's last letter in a drawer and read it on the anniversaries of the days he had written it. A wife who had received a telegram instead of her husband learned to raise their children with stories of the man they would never know. A community that had sent its young men off with pride now gathered to remember them at memorials and in quiet conversations that stretched across decades. The scars were not only on the bodies of the men who had fought. They were in the altered rhythms of families who would never again be whole, and the changed outlooks of communities that had learned what total war could demand, and in the collective memory of a nation that would carry the example of Tarawa forward into every conflict that followed. What had been bought with those lives was not only strategic ground or military advantage. It was the enduring reminder that freedom is never free and that the people who pay its price are never statistics, they are sons and brothers and friends whose absence echoes through generations. The larger meaning of Tarawa unfolded slowly in the years after the battle. The tiny atoll had altered the trajectory of the Pacific War by proving that the Central Pacific strategy could succeed, even at terrible cost. It had forced changes in doctrine and equipment that saved lives in every subsequent campaign. It had given the nation an example of courage under conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. And it had reminded everyone who learned its story that the price of victory is always measured in lives given, not in territory gained or in days of fighting. The men who had survived carried that reminder with them into whatever lives they built afterward. They raised families, worked jobs, and watched their world change, but they never forgot the narrow strip of coral where so many had fallen and where they themselves had been asked to give more than they had ever imagined they possessed. The example they set was not one of perfect heroism or unbroken strength. It was the example of ordinary young men who kept moving forward, who looked after one another, and who refused to let the darkness win even when the cost was higher than anyone could have predicted. As the decades passed and new generations learned the story of Tarawa, the meaning of what had been bought with those lives continued to evolve. It became a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to keep going anyway. It became a testament to the bonds that form between people who face the impossible together. It became a warning that the price of freedom is always paid by individuals whose names deserve to be spoken and whose stories deserve to be remembered. The farm boy from Iowa, the Philadelphia kid, and the thoughtful Marine from Oregon grew old carrying those truths. They spoke of them when the time felt right and kept them in silence when words were not enough. What they had bought with their survival was the chance to live in a world where the lessons of Tarawa could still matter, where the courage of ordinary people could still be honored, and where the names of the fallen could still be carried forward by those who had the privilege of coming home. If the deeply human cost and the enduring meaning of Tarawa, the lives given, the lessons learned, and the example of courage that continues to echo, have stayed with you, And you want to help ensure that these stories and these sacrifices are preserved with care and honesty for the generations who will come after us. Even the smallest contribution makes a real difference. Supporting this work with a small tip on Ko-Fi, starting at just $1, helps keep the research and the storytelling alive so that the full truth of what these ordinary young men endured is never forgotten. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the last light faded on the island that had once been a battlefield and had become a place of remembrance, the men who had fought there stood together one final time in memory. They had crossed the reef, held the beach through the night, taken the airfield, cleared the hidden places, and faced the final furious stands. They had buried their friends and carried their names home. They had paid a price that could never be repaid, but they had also bought something that would outlast any single battle or any single generation. They had bought the chance for others to live in a world where courage could still be found in ordinary people, where the bonds between those who fight together could still be stronger than fear, and where the memory of what had been lost could still shape what was yet to come. The tiny atoll had changed the course of a war and the lives of everyone it had touched. The men who had survived it carried its story forward, not as a tale of perfect victory, but as a testament to what ordinary human beings can endure and what they can achieve when they refuse to leave one another behind. That story belongs to all of us now. It is a reminder that the price of freedom is always measured in lives given, and that the debt we owe to those who paid it can only be honored by remembering their names, telling their stories, and living in a way that makes their sacrifice meaningful for as long as we have breath to speak and hearts to remember.